Hello story enthusiasts. Welcome to Supreme Harry. Today we venture into, what if Harry refused all 22 lordships at Gringotts and Dumbledore lost his magic instantly? Your support means everything, like and subscribe. Enjoy. Chapter 1, The Vault Below the World. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Harry Potter had been awake for 2 hours by then, sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet under the sink, eating the heel of a bread loaf that Dudley hadn't wanted. He was used to the floor. The chair at the table was technically available, but Aunt Petunia had a way of looking at him when he sat in it, a long, thin look, like she was calculating something unpleasant, and the floor was easier. He was 11 today. Nobody had mentioned it. The owl came through the mail slot at 7:30, which was impressive since the mail slot was barely wide enough for a catalogue. The letter dropped onto the mat with a soft sound, cream-colored envelope, green ink, his name written in a hand he didn't recognize. He picked it up before Dudley thundered downstairs, which was pure instinct. Anything interesting that came into this house was immediately confiscated, examined, and either kept or destroyed depending on whether Uncle Vernon thought it was funny. Mr. H. Potter, The Cupboard Under the Stairs, 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He stared at that for a moment. The cupboard under the stairs. Someone had written that like it was a perfectly normal address, which meant someone knew, which meant, he wasn't sure what it meant. He tucked the letter under his shirt and went back to the kitchen. The Dursleys had a magnificent row about it later, after Vernon found the feathers the owl had shed near the mat. Harry sat through breakfast with the envelope pressed against his sternum, eating his half-portion of eggs, and said nothing. He was good at saying nothing. He'd had 11 years of practice. He read the letter that afternoon in the garden while Dudley was at Piers Pocus's house. He read it 3 times. Then he sat very still for a while, watching a beetle navigate the grass, and thought about what it meant that there was apparently an entire world he'd never been told about. He wasn't as surprised as he probably should have been. Funny things had always happened around Harry. Teachers had complained about it, Aunt Petunia had beaten it out of him at least twice, and Uncle Vernon had once locked him in the cupboard for a week after Harry had accidentally regrown his hair overnight following a particularly bad trim. The strange things happened whether Harry wanted them to or not, which had always suggested to him that the strangeness wasn't coming from him exactly, it was more like it was in him, waiting, like water in a well. He packed that night. He didn't have much. 2 shirts, his school trousers, the photograph of a motorbike he'd torn from a magazine because he'd always liked the look of it. He put the letter on top and closed the bag. In the morning he walked downstairs at 6, set his house key on the kitchen counter, and left through the front door without saying goodbye to anyone. Nobody was awake to say it to. The man waiting at the end of Privet Drive was not what Harry expected from a magical guide. He'd half imagined someone tall, robed, mysterious. What he got was a squat, broad-shouldered wizard named Phileas, not Flitwick, he was quick to say, just Phileas, a junior Gringotts liaison, who had round glasses very similar to Harry's own and the general energy of someone who had been doing this job long enough to stop being impressed by it. What sort of ritual? Harry asked. The kind that tells you what you're inheriting. He paused. Also what's been done to you. Medically speaking. Harry looked at him. What's been done to me? Phileas adjusted his glasses. That's what the ritual will tell us. He said it in the tone of a man who already knew the answer and wasn't happy about it. Gringotts was, Harry searched for the right word as they climbed the white stone steps, certain of itself. That was it. The pillars weren't trying to impress anyone. The goblins at the long counter weren't performing efficiency, they simply were efficient, moving through their work with the focused economy of people who had been doing important things for so long that the importance had become unremarkable. Phileas led him not to the main counter but through a door to the left of it, down a corridor that Harry suspected wasn't available to most visitors. The walls changed from marble to raw stone. Torches replaced the chandeliers. The air got cooler and tasted faintly of iron. The room they entered was circular, smaller than Harry expected, and occupied by a single goblin seated at a stone desk. Ragnar was old. Not old the way Uncle Vernon was old, puffy and gradually deteriorating, but old the way mountains were old, like time had pressed him into something denser and harder and more true. His hands on the desk were the size of Harry's, but the fingers were long and knotted, and his eyes were the particular sharp amber of an animal that had never once been prey. "Harry James Potter," Ragnar said. Not a greeting. An identification. "Yes," Harry said. "Sit." Harry sat. Phileas took a position near the door, folding his hands. "You know why you're here?" Phileas said. "There's a ritual. For heirs of significant accounts." "For heirs of any account," Ragnar said, "but more urgently for yours." He slid a shallow stone bowl across the desk. The inside was etched with runes that Harry didn't recognize. 3 drops of blood. "The bowl will tell us what we need to know. I will explain what it finds." Harry looked at the silver needle beside the bowl. "Is this going to hurt?" "Less than your childhood," Ragnar said flatly, which was such an unexpected thing to say that Harry laughed, a short, sharp sound that seemed to startle the old goblin slightly. Then Ragnar made a sound that might have been amusement and might have been something else entirely. Harry picked up the needle, pressed it to his fingertip, and let 3 drops fall. The runes in the bowl lit up one at a time, amber and then white and then a deep, complicated red that cast shadows upward. Ragnar leaned forward, studying the pattern. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a quality of attention that sharpened until it was almost a physical presence in the room. He sat back. "There is good news," he said, "and there is news that will require you to decide something significant." "What's the good news?" "Your personal vault, Vault 112, established by your parents separately from the Potter estate, contains sufficient funds to cover your Hogwarts education in full, with substantial remainder. It was sealed under a condition that it passed to you on your 11th birthday without interference from any executor or guardian. It is yours absolutely, and no one can touch it." Harry nodded. "And the other news?" Ragnar reached beneath his desk and brought out a wooden box, long and flat, the kind that held pens in the mundane world. He set it on the desk between them and opened it. 22 rings lay in a row on black velvet. They were extraordinary objects, each one, Harry could see that even without knowing anything about them. Old gold, old silver, stones that seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. They sat in the box like sleeping things. Through your mother's line, your father's line, blood debts owed and paid, ancient compacts, and the deaths of individuals who named you heir in absentia, Ragnar said, you are the legal claimant to 22 separate lordships. Some are dormant. Several are not. Among them are the lordships of Potter, Peveril, Gryffindor, Slytherin. He paused briefly on that one, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, Black, Gaunt, Emrys, and 13 others of varying but significant power. Harry looked at the rings. The room was very quiet. "If I accept them," he said slowly, "what does that mean?" "It means you become one of the most politically powerful individuals in Wizarding Britain before your first day of school. You gain access to the vaults, properties, and accumulated magical resources of all 22 families. You gain seats on the Wizengamot. You gain obligations, to the families, to the old compacts, to the traditions that come with each lordship. You become a piece on the board." Ragnar's amber eyes were steady. "Many powerful people have been waiting for you to sit down at that table for 10 years. Harry was quiet for a moment. "Then, who set this up?" "All of it. Who made it so I'd come here and find all of this waiting?" "The executor of your parents' estate. Albus Dumbledore. He knew about all 22. He has known since your birth. The lordship claims were documented in full and placed in his keeping. He has been managing them, not on your behalf, technically. The goblins have been managing them. But he was aware." Ragnar's voice was perfectly neutral. "He assumed you would accept." "Most do." Harry looked at the rings again. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs. He thought about the address on his letter, the cupboard under the stairs, written down like it was acceptable, like someone had looked at his life and decided it would serve a purpose. He thought about Phileas's careful phrasing, "What's been done to you, medically speaking?" He thought about the word board, "You become a piece on the board," and the particular way Ragnarok had said it, not with approval, not with criticism, just with the precision of a man describing a trap. "What was done to me?" he asked. The ritual found something. Ragnarok opened a second document and slid it across the desk. Harry read it. It took him a moment to understand what he was reading, and another moment to understand what it meant, and by the time he'd finished he was very calm in the way that he sometimes went calm, like a part of him had assessed the situation and decided that emotion was currently inefficient. There were 3 magical bindings on him. Not curses, compulsions. Old, layered, careful. One suppressed his magical output to roughly 40% of its natural capacity. One inclined him toward deference, toward seeking approval from authority figures, toward self-minimizing. One was a monitoring charm, persistent, tied to a specific magical signature. Dumbledore's signature. Can they be removed? Harry asked. Yes. It will take approximately 2 hours. Your magic will feel different afterward. Larger. Ragnarok looked at him carefully. We recommend you sit with the knowledge before making any decisions. Remove them, Harry said. All 3. Now. Ragnarok studied him for a moment. Then he nodded once, sharp and precise, like a door closing. Before we proceed, the old goblin said, the rings. What is your answer? Harry looked at them one last time. 22 lordships. Gryffindor and Slytherin both, which was so absurd it would have been funny if it weren't so obviously a mechanism for control. Give him everything, make him responsible for everything, tie him to the old world so thoroughly that he became its instrument rather than his own person. The rings were beautiful. They were also a cage with very good aesthetics. No, Harry said. Phileas made a small sound near the door. Ragnarok didn't move. All 22. All 22. Harry met the goblin's eyes. I don't want what other people decided I should inherit. If I build something, it'll be mine. Not a collection of debts I didn't choose. The silence that followed was long enough that Harry wondered if he'd said something wrong. Then Ragnarok closed the box. In 40 years, the goblin said slowly, I have conducted this ritual 112 times. You are the first to refuse a single lordship, let alone all of them. He paused. I want you to understand what you're refusing. The political leverage alone, I know, Harry said. I don't want political leverage from dead people. I want to go to school. Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind those amber eyes, not surprise exactly, but a quality of recognition, like a very old creature encountering something it hadn't expected to encounter and finding it more interesting than anything it had seen in a very long time. As you wish, Ragnarok said. The ritual to remove your bindings will begin immediately. I will oversee it personally. 2 hours later, Harry Potter walked out of the binding removal chamber and stood in the corridor for a moment with his eyes closed. It was like someone had opened a window in a room he'd lived in his whole life and not known was sealed. His magic was there, not trickling through a restricted channel but present in full, and it was vast, and it was his, and it was so natural that he couldn't understand why he hadn't noticed its absence before. He flexed his fingers. The torches in the corridor brightened. He relaxed, and they dimmed back to normal. He could feel the stone walls, the deep bedrock below, the enormous weight of Gringotts above him, not in any spooky supernatural sense but the way you feel a fire's warmth, a simple, physical awareness of the world's magical signature. Phileas was watching him with the expression of someone who had braced for impact. Ragnarok stood a step behind, hands folded, watching with that same quality of focused attention. How do you feel? Phileas asked carefully. Like myself, Harry said, and he meant it in a way that was more complicated than it sounded. He turned to Ragnarok. Thank you. The goblin inclined his head, a gesture, Harry sensed, that Ragnarok did not make casually. Gringotts protects its account holders, he said. What was done to you was done without our knowledge or consent. It will not happen again. A pause. We will be watching, Mr. Potter. Not to interfere. We simply find it useful to keep track of interesting developments. Harry almost smiled. Fair enough. Across Britain, in a small, precise moment that no one witnessed, Albus Dumbledore reached for his magic and found silence. He was in his office at Hogwarts, writing a letter. It was a routine moment, the kind of moment he'd inhabited 10,000 times, magic as natural as breathing, the pleasant background hum of a life lived entirely within its warmth. He'd reached for a simple spell, barely a cantrip, and his hand had moved and his will had moved and nothing had happened. He tried again. Silence. He stood up from his desk very slowly. Outside his window, the Scottish mountains were gold and green and distant. Fawkes was on his perch and the phoenix looked at him with those ancient, unreadable eyes, and for once Dumbledore found them frightening. He tried a fourth time. Then a fifth. He tried the way you try a door that should be unlocked, pressing his will against the boundary of his own power with increasing urgency, and each time he met nothing. Not a block, not a wall. Just absence. Like reaching for something that had always been there and finding that the shelf was bare. He sat back down. His hands, he noticed, were shaking slightly. He was not a man who panicked. He had survived a century of magical conflict, faced down dark wizards and darker magic and the particular darkness of his own history, and in every instance he had found the still center of himself and worked from there. He found it now, assembled his considerable intellect around the situation, and began to think. The compact. He'd known about it, of course, had always known, in the abstract theoretical way that one knows about the foundations of a house without thinking about the foundations very often. The ancient magical compact between Dumbledore's bloodline and the Potter bloodline went back 4 generations, binding his family's power partly to their role as guides and guardians of the Potter heirs. The magic of it was subtle and rarely relevant. It had never been relevant because the Potters had always, he stopped. He reached for the bond with careful mental fingers and felt it clearly for the first time, severed. Not broken violently but released, the way you release a handshake. Clean. Deliberate. Final. The boy. He had refused. Dumbledore sat in his chair with his silent hands in his lap and the Scottish light moving across his desk, and he thought about an 11-year-old boy in a vault below London making a choice that no one had expected him to make, and he felt, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely uncertain about what was going to happen next. Harry emerged from Gringotts into the noise and color of Diagon Alley and stopped on the steps to get his bearings. It was extraordinary. He'd known that intellectually from the letter, which had described a wizarding shopping district in fairly practical terms, but the letter had not prepared him for the sheer liveliness of it, the shopfronts with their impossible displays, the cauldrons stacked 6 high outside the apothecary, the children his age pulling their parents in 3 directions at once, the general atmosphere of a world that had been existing cheerfully and completely without his knowledge for his entire life. He had Vault 112's key in his pocket. He had a list. He had, for the first time in 11 years, absolutely nobody telling him what to do. He went to Flourish and Blots first, because books were non-negotiable. The Hogwarts list covered the basics, but Harry spent 20 minutes in the restricted access section of the children's floor, not the actual restricted section, just the more advanced texts, reading opening pages and making decisions. He bought everything on the list and 4 books that weren't on it, a comprehensive history of magical law, an intermediate text on magical theory, a goblin-authored account of wizarding Britain's political structure, and a slim volume called The Nature of Inherent Magic that the shopkeeper tried to steer him away from with a comment about it being quite advanced for first years. Harry bought it anyway. He was at the apothecary when he became aware that he was being watched. Not with malice, he didn't think, more with the kind of intent observation that precedes a decision. He turned and found a woman standing in the entrance to the leaky cauldron across the way, middle-aged, brown hair threaded with gray, wearing robes that had clearly been expensive once and were now very clean and very worn. She was watching him with an expression that Harry couldn't quite read, something between recognition and grief, there and gone so fast he might have imagined it. He made eye contact and she looked away immediately, disappeared back through the leaky cauldron's door. He filed it and went back to the apothecary. Madame Malkin's was crowded. 3 fittings happening simultaneously, a mother and daughter arguing in a corner about sleeve length, and a boy Harry's age standing on a platform near the window being measured with the expression of someone who had been doing this since birth and found it rather beneath him. "Hogwarts," the boy said, glancing at Harry as he stepped up onto the adjacent platform. "Yeah," Harry said. "First year obviously." "I'm Draco." He said it the way some people say their last name when they know their last name is supposed to mean something. "Harry." Draco looked at him with the practiced appraisal of a boy who'd been taught to assess people before deciding how to talk to them. Harry looked back with simple, direct attention, not aggressive, not performative, just present. "What house do you think you'll be in?" Draco asked. "Don't know yet. I'll find out when I get there." "My whole family's been Slytherin," Draco said. "It's basically certain for me. Some houses are better than others, obviously." "Obviously," Harry agreed mildly, which wasn't the response Draco had been expecting. He'd been waiting, Harry sensed, for either agreement or a challenge, and getting neither seemed to throw him off slightly. "Do you know much about Hogwarts?" "Getting there," Harry said. "I've been reading. My father says Dumbledore is losing his grip on the school. All kinds of questionable appointments recently. He said my father says with the confidence of a boy who had learned to treat his father's opinions as geological fact." "Do you know Dumbledore?" "Not personally." "He's the one who placed you with your Muggle relatives, wasn't he?" "Everyone knows the story." Harry glanced at him. "Does everyone?" "It's not a secret. The boy who lived, raised by Muggles, the great Dumbledore watching over everything." There was something in his voice, not mockery exactly, more like the careful positioning of someone who didn't know yet where he stood. "My father thinks the whole thing was a power play. Keeping you controllable." "Your father," Harry said, "might be right about that one." Draco blinked. This clearly wasn't the script. "You're not what I expected," Draco said finally. "What did you expect?" "Someone more," he searched for it. "More interested in being impressive." Harry smiled, and it was a real smile, unbothered and direct. "I've got time to be impressive. Right now I'm just getting my robes." Draco looked at him for another moment with an expression that was genuinely uncertain, a boy who had prepared for this interaction in various ways and found that none of his preparations applied, and then he almost smiled too. "Fair enough," he said. It sounded like something he didn't say often. Madame Malkin finished with Harry's measurements and he stepped down, gathering his parcels. "Malfoy," Harry said, because he'd worked out the last name by then, for what it's worth, the part about keeping things controllable. "That's done now." "What does that mean?" Harry picked up his bag. "It means I didn't take the rings." He walked out, leaving Draco Malfoy on his platform with an expression that was doing several things at once and an altitude of visible confusion. He found them near the Owl Emporium. 2 figures, both his age, both clearly Hogwarts bound by their packages and the general air of overwhelmed excitement. The girl was reading a book while walking, which Harry found immediately interesting. The boy was large, round-faced, holding a toad against his chest with the focused determination of someone whose toad had escaped recently and was not going to escape again. "He got away twice near quality Quidditch," the girl said without looking up from her book, apparently continuing a conversation. "I suggested a carrier earlier." "Neville," the boy said, "and I don't need a carrier, Gran would think." He spotted Harry and stopped. "Oh. Sorry." "It's fine," Harry said. "Nice toad." The toad regarded Harry with the ancient, exhausted dignity of amphibians everywhere. "I'm Neville Longbottom," the boy said. This is Trevor. He held the toad up slightly, apparently introducing them. And this is Hermione Granger, she knows basically everything. Hermione looked up from her book. She had brown eyes that were very sharp behind what was clearly a well-developed habit of assessing information. She looked at Harry the way she looked at the book, thoroughly. "You're Harry Potter," she said. "Yeah. I've read about you. Several books mention you." She paused. "The accounts are inconsistent. 2 of them describe you as probably being raised in luxury given the Potter family's resources. 2 of them are wrong," Harry said. "I know. I can tell by looking." She said it matter-of-factly, not unkindly. "You packed that bag yourself and those are last year's shoes and you've been reading all morning. I can see the book corners sticking out, which means you came here alone and you've been spending your time on information rather than the novelty of it." Neville looked at her with the expression of someone very used to this. "She does that," he said. "It's fine once you're used to it." Harry looked at Hermione. "What does the inconsistency in the accounts tell you?" She blinked. "Nobody, apparently, asked her that. That someone controlled the narrative," she said slowly. "That whoever managed information about you after your parents died had reasons to present a specific image." "Correct," Harry said. Hermione closed her book. Neville shifted Trevor to his other arm. "Is it true you were at Gringotts this morning? I heard some people talking near the cauldron." "Yeah. And that you..." Neville stopped. He had the look of a boy who had been raised on wizarding politics and recognized a sensitive subject when he was standing next to one. "Sorry. That's probably not my business. I refused the Lordships," Harry said simply. "All of them?" Neville stared at him. "All, the Peverell Lordship. The Gryffindor, all 22. A pause. "Why?" "Because they weren't mine," Harry said. "I didn't earn them. I was just born at the end of a long series of coincidences." He shifted his bag. "I'd rather build something." Neville was quiet. Then, in a voice that was careful and controlled in the way of someone who carried something heavy, "My gran's been telling me to claim the Longbottom Lordship since I was 8. She says it's my responsibility. Is that what you want?" Neville looked at Trevor. "I'm not sure anyone's ever asked me that before." "Well," Harry said, "you've got time to figure it out." They stood there for a moment on the busy Diagon Alley cobblestones, Harry with his bag of books, Hermione with her closed book held against her chest, Neville with his toad, and something settled between them like the first stone of something being built. "I need to get to the Owl Emporium," Harry said. "Do you want to come?" "Yes," Hermione said immediately. "Obviously," said Neville, adjusting his grip on Trevor. The owl he chose was white with amber eyes and looked at him with a directness that he found enormously refreshing in an animal. "She's been here the longest," the shopkeeper said. 7 months. Most people want the young ones or the impressive breeds. She's just, herself." The owl looked at Harry. Harry looked back. "That's fine," he said. "I'll take her." She allowed him to attach her carrier strap without any fuss, which he appreciated. He would name her later, he decided. She seemed like the kind of creature whose name should be arrived at properly, not assigned before they'd spent enough time together to know what it should be. He walked out into the afternoon with his owl and his books and Hermione Granger's brisk annotated commentary on the history of wizarding commerce, and Neville Longbottom 2 steps behind talking quietly to his toad, and the whole of Diagon Alley moving around them in its noisy, impossible color, and he felt, not happy, exactly, because happiness required more time to build than a single afternoon. But something adjacent to it. Something that was possibly its beginning. At Hogwarts, Dumbledore sat in his office and tried, for the 37th time, to summon a simple Lumos. Nothing. He lowered his wand and looked at his hands. Fawkes shifted on his perch with a sound like a single-struck note. "I know," Dumbledore said. He'd been telling himself for years that everything he'd done had been for the boy's protection. The bindings, carefully placed, he told himself they were stabilizing, that too much power in an infant was dangerous, which was true. The compulsion toward deference, he told himself it would protect Harry from recklessness, which was also true in its limited way. The monitoring charm, necessary, he'd said. Essential. He hadn't told himself the complete truth, which was that he needed Harry controllable because Dumbledore's entire strategy for defeating Voldemort depended on Harry walking into a specific sacrifice at a specific time, and boys who developed too much independent power had a tendency to find third options that disrupted careful plans. He had loved the boy. He believed that genuinely. He had made choices in the name of love that had been, in their execution, the choices of someone who valued the outcome over the person. And now the compact was severed and his magic was gone and Harry Potter was 11 years old in Diagon Alley, completely unbound for the first time in his life, and Dumbledore realized with the slow, cold clarity of a man reviewing his own mistake from the outside that he had never once asked himself what Harry actually wanted. He picked up his silent wand and held it. Outside, the mountains were going dark. The letter to the ministry could wait until morning. What couldn't wait was the conversation he was going to have with himself about what came next, not the strategy, not the greater good, not the necessary sacrifices. Just the question of what a man with no magic and a great deal of culpability was actually worth in the world he'd spent a century building. He didn't have an answer yet. He set down his wand and reached for a sheet of parchment and a quill, old methods, mundane methods, the kind he hadn't used since he was a student himself, and began to write by the light of the window. There was a great deal to reckon with. He might as well begin. Harry's aunt and uncle didn't know he'd gone until the evening, when Petunia found the key on the counter and went very still in the kitchen with it in her hand for a long moment before she put it in her pocket and said nothing to Vernon about it at all. Some things, she had learned, were easier not to explain. Harry Potter was on a bus heading back towards Surrey with an owl on his knee and a book open in the orange evening light, and for the first time in his life he was looking forward to September. Chapter 2, The Shape of a Person. The last month before Hogwarts was the strangest of Harry's life, which was saying something given that his life had included a cupboard, a letter delivered by owl, and an ancient goblin removing 3 magical compulsions from his nervous system in a stone room under London. He was still at Privet Drive. He'd considered not going back, had genuinely weighed the option while sitting on that bus with his owl, but the practical reality was that he had nowhere else to go and 4 weeks to fill, and the Dursleys were, at minimum, a known quantity. He could manage them. He'd been managing them since before he had words for what managing people meant. What was different now was that he knew it. He set up in the garden shed with a camp cot he found in the garage, which was an improvement over the cupboard in every measurable way, and when Uncle Vernon opened the shed door the first morning and started in on his usual "I don't know what you think you're doing" speech, Harry looked up from his book and said, "The shed is fine. I'll stay out of your way. I don't need anything from you." Flat, calm, completely without hostility. Vernon had expected the flinch. The speech was calibrated for the flinch. Without it, he didn't quite know where to aim himself, and he stood there for a moment in the shed doorway with his mouth open and then he closed it and left. He didn't bother Harry again for 3 weeks. The reading was extraordinary. Harry had always been good at learning, not in the way that Dudley's teachers praised learning, which meant memorizing things and reproducing them on command, but in the way that meant he couldn't stop, couldn't put a book down once it had given him something genuinely new. The magical texts did that constantly. Every page opened a door that opened onto a corridor that had 5 more doors, and he followed them all with the focused energy of someone who had been hungry for a long time and had finally found a kitchen. The nature of inherent magic was the most interesting. It didn't read like a textbook, it read like a conversation with someone very old and very precise who had spent a long time thinking about things most wizards took for granted. The author's central argument was that magic wasn't a skill or a resource but a relationship, between a person's will, their emotional architecture, and the ambient magical field that permeated everything. Most wizards used roughly 20% of their available relational capacity because they'd been trained to treat magic as a tool you wielded rather than a presence you inhabited. Harry read that section 3 times and then sat in the shed doorway in the evening light thinking about the moment in the Gringotts corridor when he'd felt the torches respond to him. He hadn't been reaching for them. He'd just been present, and the magic had moved because he was there and breathing, and the shed was just a shed and the world was just the world, and it had all felt completely natural. He went back to the book. By the end of the 3rd week he'd finished everything on the Hogwarts list and was halfway through the history of magical law, which was dry but useful in the way that maps of unfamiliar countries are useful. You might not need to know the exact location of every border right now, but knowing they exist changes how you move. He named the owl on a Wednesday. She'd been watching him read for 3 weeks with the patient amber attention of a creature that had decided to make an evaluation before committing. He'd been watching her back, in between pages. On Wednesday evening she flew down from the roof beam she'd claimed as her perch and landed on his knee entirely uninvited, regarded him with those serious eyes, and then pressed the top of her head briefly against his chin before flying back up. "Athena," he said. She ruffled her feathers once, which he took as agreement. The letter came on August 10th, exactly 3 weeks before the start of term. Not from Hogwarts, that one had already come, confirming his place and providing the platform number and departure time. This one had Gringotts' seal, and inside was a brief note in Ragnarok's precise, angular hand: "Mr. Potter. You should know that the refusal of the Lordship claims, being unprecedented in the current era, has generated significant attention in certain circles. 3 parties have made formal inquiries to Gringotts regarding the status of the unclaimed Lordships. We are bound by client confidentiality and have disclosed nothing. However, you should be aware that interested parties are interested. We have also attached a summary of an inheritance challenge filed 2 days ago by one L. Malfoy regarding the dormant Slytherin Lordship, previously blocked by your claim. Now that your claim is withdrawn, it is legally contestable. We thought you should know." Harry read this twice, set it aside, and went back to his book. Then he picked it up again and read the postscript he'd initially missed. P.S. The binding removal is permanent. If anyone attempts to reinstate them, Gringotts will know within 48 hours. We watch our account holders. He folded the letter and put it in the box under the cot where he kept things he wanted to remember. King's Cross on September 1st was noise and motion and the particular human chaos of families going somewhere important. Harry had been there at 10:20, alone with his trunk and Athena's carrier, and had navigated the barrier to platform 9 3/4 with less difficulty than the Muggle-born students around him, who hadn't been given the specific piece of information about running at the wall beforehand. He found a compartment near the middle of the train, stowed his trunk, and opened his book. The compartment filled gradually. First Neville, who arrived slightly breathless and immediately wedged himself in opposite with Trevor's carrier and a package from his grandmother that he hadn't opened yet. Then Hermione, who came in with a very organized trolley and checked that there was enough overhead space before she committed to a seat, which Harry found very Hermione. Then, about 20 minutes before departure, a pair of identical red-haired boys appeared in the compartment doorway, assessed the available space, appeared to have a silent conversation in the way of people who had been doing this since before they learned to talk, and then one of them said, "Perfectly acceptable first-year compartment. No obvious disasters in progress." "We'll leave you to it," said the other. "Unless," said the first, "you want test subjects for our latest product, which is still in testing, so results may vary, significantly," concluded the second, grinning. "What does it do?" Harry asked. They both looked at him with the interested expression of identical twins whose default setting was "this might be fun." "At the moment," said the first, "it makes the target's hair stand straight up for approximately 6 minutes. Completely harmless. Mostly harmless. We're working on mostly." "Fred and George Weasley," said the other one, apparently providing credentials. "Harry Potter," Harry said, "and I'll pass on the hair, but I'm curious about the underlying charm." They both brightened considerably. "Underlying charm's a modified Ventus with a cosmetic overlay and a timed reversal, which isn't quite working yet, the reversal, not the Ventus. The Ventus is perfect," Fred said, with the pride of a craftsman. "5 minutes," George said, "or we'll actually miss the train." They disappeared. Harry went back to his book, quietly satisfied. Neville had been watching this exchange with the expression of someone storing information. "You're not what people expected," he said. "Second time I've heard that in 2 weeks," Harry said. "What were they expecting?" "Someone more impressed with himself, I think." He turned a page. "Or more intimidated. One or the other." Hermione looked up from her own book. She'd had one open since sitting down, which Harry respected deeply. "Both reactions would be understandable given the circumstances," she said. "You've just discovered the entire wizarding world, you're apparently heir to an enormous amount of political power." She paused delicately, because she'd clearly been deciding whether to mention this, "and you're 11. Most people would be either overwhelmed or inflated." "I was both for about 5 minutes in the Gringotts vault room," Harry said. "Then I started reading." Hermione looked at him for a moment with an expression that was working something out. "Reading made it better?" "Reading made it real," he said. "Once it's real you can think about it. Once you can think about it, you can decide what to do." He glanced up. "What made it real for you?" "You're Muggle-born, my letter," she said, and something shifted in her voice, not sadness exactly, but a kind of careful handling of something precious. "I did 11 days of research before I told my parents I wanted to go. I needed to understand it first." A brief pause. "My parents were very supportive. They are very supportive. They said if I wanted it, I should go." She looked out the window at the platform sliding away as the train began to move. "I want it very much." Neville was quiet for a moment. Then, "I always knew I'd come. It was never a question of whether. Just whether I'd be good enough." He said it without self-pity, which made it worse somehow. Just a fact he'd been carrying for a long time. Harry put down his book. "Good enough for what?" Neville looked at Trevor's carrier. "My family's a big deal. Old name, old magic, lots of expectations. My gran basically raised me as a," he searched for it, "as a project. Like if she shaped me right, I'd turn out to be the person the family needed." He half smiled, and it was a complicated smile. "She was disappointed for a while because my magic was slow to develop. She thought I might be a squib. Dropped me out a window once to try to trigger it." Harry stared at him. "She meant well," Neville said immediately. "She was worried, she dropped you out a window. 2 stories. I bounced." He looked genuinely unsure whether this was funny or not. Hermione had closed her book entirely, which was a significant indication of how she felt about this information. "Neville," Harry said carefully, "that's not a normal thing." "I know," Neville said. "Then, I know. She's all I have. My parents are at St. Mungo's. They've been there since I was a baby." He said it very levelly, like something recited, and Harry understood that it was recited because it had to be recited in a certain way or it became something he couldn't manage in public. "So it's just Gran and me, and she loves me, she just has a specific idea of who you're supposed to be," Harry finished. "Yeah." The train moved through the outskirts of London and Harry looked at Neville, round-faced, earnest, holding his toad carrier like an anchor, and thought about compulsions that weren't laid on you by magical ritual. The ones that came from love and expectation and never being asked what you actually wanted. Just as binding as the ones he'd had removed. Maybe more, because those ones had a face attached to them that you loved. "For what it's worth," Harry said, "I think you'll be fine." "You don't know that." "You're right," Harry said. "But you carried a toad all the way through Diagon Alley and through King's Cross and onto this train and you haven't lost it once, and I think that counts for something in terms of character." Neville looked at him blankly for a moment, and then he laughed, genuine, surprised, a little involuntary, and it changed his whole face. Hermione was smiling behind her book. The trolley came. Harry bought enough for everyone, which prompted the usual protest from Hermione, "I have my own money, thank you," and no protest at all from Neville, who accepted a chocolate frog with the air of a boy who had given up on pride in the face of chocolate frogs. The compartment door opened an hour in and 3 boys appeared who Harry had been expecting in some form or another. Draco Malfoy had changed into his robes and brought 2 people who were clearly there to function as a social backdrop. He looked at Harry with the expression of someone who had been thinking about their last conversation and hadn't finished thinking about it. "Potter," he said. It had a different quality than it had in Madame Malkin's, more formal, more performed, like he was doing this for an audience. "Draco," Harry said. A pause. Draco hadn't expected first names. "I wanted to ask, what you said, about the rings." "Did you mean?" "Yes," Harry said. "All of them?" "All 22. Draco processed this. His 2 companions, Crabbe and Goyle, Harry would learn, were looking at each other with the blankness of boys who had come for a straightforward social interaction and found themselves in something more complicated. "My father is contesting the Slytherin lordship," Draco said. It sounded like he was feeling out how Harry would react. "I know. Ragnarok told me." "Does it?" He stopped. Then, with an effort at casualness that was a little too visible to be casual, "Does it bother you?" Harry considered him. Draco Malfoy was performing right now, he could see that, performing for his friends, for the idea of this moment, for the story he'd go home and tell his father. But underneath the performance there was a boy who was genuinely curious, who had met Harry in a robe shop and found him incomprehensible, and who had been thinking about him since. "The Slytherin lordship is yours if you want to fight for it," Harry said. "I gave it up." "That means it's in play." He paused. "Just be sure you want what comes with it and not just the idea of it." "That's easy for you to say. You gave everything up." "I kept my own vault," Harry said. "Money my parents put aside for me before anything else happened. That one I kept." He looked at Draco steadily. "There's a difference between what people decide you're supposed to inherit and what's actually yours." Draco stood in the doorway for a moment longer than the scene required. "Slytherin," he said finally, as if reminding himself of something. "I'll see you at the sorting." He turned, and Crabbe and Goyle turned with him, and the compartment door closed. Hermione looked at Harry over the top of her book. "What?" Harry said. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just deciding if Draco Malfoy is interesting or not." "Verdict?" "Jury's out," she said. "He's smart enough to know you confused him. That's something." They arrived at Hogsmeade Station in the dark, which was clearly by design. The first view of Hogwarts across the lake was meant to do something to you, and it did. Harry had been successfully managing the novelty of everything all day, keeping it at arm's length with the practiced distance of someone used to not getting their hopes up, but Hogwarts from the water was something else entirely. It was alive. That was the only word for it. Not just lit and large and ancient, those were all true, but present, the way very old things with deep magic in their bones were present. He could feel it from the boat, the way he'd felt the deep bedrock under Gringotts, a hum that wasn't sound. Neville beside him had gone very quiet. On his other side, Hermione was looking at the castle with the expression of someone seeing in physical form something they had loved in the abstract for a long time, and it was a little heartbreaking and mostly wonderful. "Okay," Harry said quietly, to no one in particular. "Yeah," said Neville. Professor McGonagall was exactly as advertised by the history texts, which was to say she was formidable in the specific way of a person who had never had time for nonsense and had now been dealing with 11-year-olds for long enough that she developed a comprehensive taxonomy of nonsense that she deployed against all varieties with equal efficiency. She gave them the speech about the sorting with the practiced delivery of someone who had given it perhaps 300 times and still gave it seriously because the occasion required seriousness. Harry listened carefully. The sorting hat, she explained, would consider each student's qualities and choose their house accordingly. The 4 houses valued different things: bravery, ambition, knowledge, loyalty. "It's not really like that, though," Harry said to Neville quietly, "is it? The books say the hat reads the student's complete character." The division into single traits is a simplification. My gran said the hat can be argued with, Neville whispered back. Can it? She argued with it for 20 minutes apparently. She was going to be Ravenclaw. Is she Gryffindor? Pure, terrifying Gryffindor, Neville confirmed. The doors opened and they filed into the great hall, and Harry focused on not being distracted by the enchanted ceiling, midnight blue and perfectly true to the sky outside, stars scattered across it in their correct configurations, because he'd read about it and confirmed its accuracy by checking the star positions against a map he'd memorized. And being smug about astronomical accuracy in a magical castle was probably not the most productive use of his mental energy right now. He watched the sorting with the attention he'd been giving everything since Gringotts, not passive observation but active consideration. The hat spent different amounts of time on different students. A few were instant. Draco Malfoy was Slytherin before the hat properly settled on his head, which seemed to confirm something. Some took longer. Hannah Abbott took nearly 30 seconds. The hat appeared to be making a genuine argument with itself. Hermione was Gryffindor. She walked to the table with her back very straight and an expression that was working very hard not to be relieved. Neville was called. He walked up, sat down, put the hat on, and sat very still for what felt like a long time. Harry watched his face, eyes closed, the particular stillness of someone in conversation. Then, Gryffindor. Neville opened his eyes, looked at Harry across the hall with an expression of mild shock, and went to sit down. Harry Potter. The hall went very quiet in a way it hadn't gone quiet for anyone else. He walked up through the silence with his hands in his pockets, sat on the stool, and the hat dropped over his eyes. The inside of the hat was dark and smelled of old cloth and something else, something warm and faintly familiar that he couldn't place. Well, said a voice, directly inside his skull, this is genuinely unusual. For me or for you? Harry thought back. For both of us, I suspect. I've been doing this for 1,000 years. I don't often meet students who've refused the Peverell Lordship before walking through those doors. A pause. Or the other 21, for that matter. Does that affect the sorting? It affects everything about you, boy, but not in the way you'd expect. You've more than enough courage for Gryffindor. Your mind would be at home in Ravenclaw. You have a Slytherin's understanding of power and a Hufflepuff's bone-deep loyalty to the people you've decided matter. The voice was thoughtful. Most students have a clear lean. You're remarkably balanced. This doesn't happen often. So where do I go? That's what I'm deciding. A pause. Where do you want to go? I want to go where I'll learn the most. Most students say where I belong or where I'll be happiest. I can build happiness, Harry thought. I can't build an education unless I'm somewhere it's actually possible. So where will I learn the most? A longer pause. Something moved in the darkness of the hat, like someone genuinely reconsidering. An interesting metric, the hat said finally. And then, without further deliberation, it addressed the hall, Gryffindor. The noise was immediate and total. Harry pulled the hat off, handed it back to Professor McGonagall, who was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read at all, and walked to the Gryffindor table. Hermione shifted along the bench to make room. Fred Weasley, 3 seats down, leaned over and said, "The hat was on you for nearly 2 minutes. That's third longest we've ever seen." "What's first?" Harry asked. "Neville," George said from beside Fred. "Different year." "Gryffindor." Neville, across the table, looked briefly startled and then quietly pleased. The feast was extraordinary in the way that first feasts at magical schools presumably were. Harry ate and talked and watched the room with the particular noticing habit he'd developed in 11 years of having to pay attention to social dynamics for survival purposes. He watched the teachers. Professor Quirrell, at the head table, had the general aura of a man trying to seem nervous so as not to seem whatever he actually was, which was a strange choice. Professor Snape was watching Harry with the focused displeasure of someone who had been waiting for a specific problem to arrive, which was interesting. McGonagall was calm and watchful and utterly professional. Dumbledore was not at the head table. Harry noticed that almost immediately and said nothing about it. He watched the empty chair at the center of the head table, the headmaster's seat, and noted its vacancy the way he'd note the position of any significant piece on a board. "Has anyone seen Dumbledore?" he asked casually, to the table in general. Fred and George exchanged a glance. "He's been," Fred started. "Under the weather," George finished. "Since about a month ago," Fred said. "Very sudden," said George, and the way they said it together made it clear they found it as interesting as Harry did. "He was in the hospital wing for 2 weeks, Percy Weasley said from further down the table, with the manner of someone who had official information. "He's recovered. Apparently he'll be taking on his duties again fully." "Recovered from what?" Hermione asked. Percy opened his mouth and closed it. "That part wasn't announced." Harry looked at the empty chair. McGonagall, he noticed, was watching the same chair. Her expression was the expression of a woman navigating a situation she hadn't anticipated and had not yet decided how to feel about. He filed it all carefully. He found Dumbledore's magic absence through a completely different route than he'd expected, and the route was Neville. After the feast, walking up the staircases toward Gryffindor Tower with the other first years and Percy as their guide, Neville fell into step beside Harry and said quietly, "My Gran told me something before I left. She said that Dumbledore's influence with the old families has fractured, somehow. Nobody knows exactly why. But 3 families that usually back him in the Wizengamot have suddenly stopped returning his letters." "When did this start?" "About a month ago." Harry walked up the stairs and thought about the Gringotts Compact and what Ragnarok had told him and the timing of all of it, and he thought about a man who had built a century of power on a foundation that had quietly been removed from beneath him. "Neville," he said, "does your grandmother know who you're friends with yet?" "I wrote her from the train," Neville said. "She wrote back in about 40 minutes, which is physically impossible but she does it anyway. She said," he paused. "She said to be careful and to remember our family's political position." "What did you write back?" "I haven't yet." He looked sideways at Harry. "I wasn't sure what to say." "Tell her the truth," Harry said. "Tell her you've made a friend who gave up the Peveril lordship because he didn't want someone else's idea of who he should be." He glanced at Neville. "And then tell her what you think about that." Neville was quiet for 3 whole staircases. "Then, she's going to have opinions." "Grandmothers generally do," Hermione said from behind them. "Extremely powerful ones in particular," Harry agreed. The Gryffindor common room was everything a common room should be: fire, squashy armchairs, the accumulated warmth of a space where people had been comfortable for centuries. The older students dispersed in various directions and the first years clustered near the fire in the natural grouping of people who were all slightly overwhelmed and finding comfort in proximity. Harry sat in an armchair that immediately felt right and opened his book, because it was past 9 and he wasn't tired and he had 70 pages left in the magical law text and the section on inheritance challenges was directly relevant now. "You're reading," Ron Weasley said, with the tone of someone noting an unusual geological phenomenon. Ron had appeared in their compartment somewhere around Newcastle with a chess set and a kind of instinctive goodness that came off him like warmth off a fire. Harry liked him immediately but hadn't had 3 hours to read him properly yet. "Yes," Harry said. "It's the first night. Good time to read." "Quiet." He glanced up. "You play chess." "Better than anyone I know." "Teach me tomorrow." Ron blinked. "You don't know chess." "I know the rules. I've never played someone good." He looked at Ron steadily. "I learn best from people who are better than me." Ron sat down on the rug near the armchair with the expression of someone who had not expected to be given a straightforward compliment tonight and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. "Okay," he said. "Tomorrow." Hermione came and sat nearby with her own book. Neville was writing a letter by the fire, very carefully, and Harry watched him write it and turn it over once and look at it and then fold it with the deliberateness of a decision being made. 3 people, Harry thought. A girl who needed the world to make sense and was finding that it made a different kind of sense than she'd expected. A boy who was carrying his family like a stone and hadn't yet figured out that he could put it down. And a boy with a chessboard who had the goodness of someone who had never needed to calculate whether to trust, which was its own kind of strength. Harry looked around the common room, at the fire, at the portraits on the wall, at the staircase going up to where he'd be sleeping in a proper bed for the first time in recent memory, and thought about the word home and what it actually required. Not a place, he decided. He'd figured that out in the shed at Privet Drive. People. The right people, chosen freely, who chose you back. He was getting there. He was nearly asleep that night when he registered, in the way you register things at the edge of sleep, that the monitoring charm was gone, the one that had been tied to Dumbledore's signature, feeding back information about Harry's location and emotional state and magical output for God knew how many years. Gone, along with all the rest. It occurred to him that Dumbledore, without his magic and without his monitoring charm, was currently operating blind. No information, no leverage, no quiet instrument of the greater good sitting in a Gryffindor dormitory sending back data. Just a boy who had chosen his own bed, his own books, his own people. Harry closed his eyes. The castle hummed. He slept. Dumbledore's first staff meeting without magic was a lesson in how much of his authority had been built on things that were no longer available to him. It wasn't overt, no one stood up and challenged him openly. McGonagall ran the practical side of the meeting with her usual brisk efficiency, and the other teachers deferred to his agenda, and the meeting proceeded exactly as meetings had always proceeded except that Dumbledore sat at the head of the table holding a wand that did nothing and speaking with the voice of a man who had always had, underneath every word, the quiet authority of 1,000 spells that could be cast at a moment's notice. Without that underlying reality, the words were still intelligent and the voice was still compelling, but the room felt subtly different. Thinner. Like a very good orchestra playing without the bass section. Snape noticed. Of course Snape noticed. He sat through the entire meeting with his face perfectly composed and his eyes saying something different, and afterward, when the others had filed out, he remained. Albus, he said. Severus. A pause. How long will it last? Dumbledore folded his hands on the table. I'm not certain it's temporary. Snape went very still. Then we have a problem. Several, Dumbledore agreed. Yes. He looked at his wand. Our young Mr. Potter is at Hogwarts now. In Gryffindor. I've been told his sorting took nearly 2 minutes. I noticed. He's quite different from what I expected. A pause. Freer. Snape's expression moved through something complicated too fast to catch. He's 11 and powerful and apparently uninterested in the structure you built for him. That's not freedom. That's a liability. Perhaps, Dumbledore said quietly. Or perhaps it's exactly what was needed and I was the one who couldn't see it. He set down his wand and looked at the table. I've been thinking, Severus, about the difference between a plan and a person. This isn't the time for philosophy. Isn't it? He looked up. What we built, what I built, was a structure premised on Harry Potter cooperating with his own necessity. The prophecy, the sacrifice, the arc of events I had arranged. All of it requires a cooperative subject. He paused. What Harry did at Gringotts is tell us that he is not a subject. He is a person. And persons, he said, with the quiet weight of genuine self-confrontation, have a way of finding their own roads. Snape sat in silence for a moment. Outside, Hogwarts settled around them with its ancient creaking patience. So what do we do? Snape said. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. We watch, he said. Carefully. And we consider the possibility that he might find a better road than the one I built for him. A pause. And in the meantime, Severus, watch Quirrell. Snape's eyes sharpened. You know. I suspect. And without my magic, suspicion is all I have. He stood slowly. Which means I need someone who still has theirs to be paying attention. Snape stood, his robes settling around him like something being armored. As always, he said, and the bitterness in it was old and complicated and not entirely directed at Dumbledore, which was perhaps the most honest thing Snape had said in years. He left. Dumbledore stood alone in the staff room in the particular silence of a man at the beginning of a very long reckoning, and looked at his useless wand, and decided that if wisdom was what he had left, he had better start spending it more carefully than he'd spent everything else. Chapter 3, What Magic Remembers. The first classes at Hogwarts had a way of sorting people that the Sorting Hat never managed, not by house or courage or ambition, but by the more fundamental question of what happened when someone put a wand in your hand and told you to make something happen. Some students froze. Some overreached. Some performed competently and immediately began worrying about whether competently was enough. And some, a very few, seemed to have been waiting for permission, and when the permission arrived, they were already moving. Harry fell into that last category, which surprised him less than it surprised everyone else. Transfiguration was first, and Professor McGonagall opened with the transformation of a match into a needle, which she performed herself with the crisp efficiency of someone demonstrating what the destination looked like before asking you to find your own way there. The match became a needle in the time it took to draw breath. She set it on her desk and looked at the class. You will observe that the transformation is complete, material, structure, and function have changed entirely. Transfiguration is not an illusion. It is a fundamental renegotiation of what a thing is. She paused. The most common error is attempting the transformation before you understand what you're asking the object to become. Begin with understanding. Then act. Harry turned his match over in his fingers. He could feel it, not imagining it, but actually feeling the grain of the wood, the trace chemical signature of the phosphorus tip, the particular density of something that had been made for a specific single purpose. He thought about the needle, silver, smooth, the cold specific weight of metal, the purpose of passing thread through fabric rather than striking flame. He placed the two images in relationship and drew his wand. The match became a needle. Not perfectly, it retained a faint grain at the base, wood memory, but it was a needle. Silver and pointed and cool when he picked it up. McGonagall was beside his desk before he'd fully registered her moving. She picked up the needle. Examined it. Set it down. Mr. Potter. Professor. How did you approach that? I tried to understand what both things were before asking one to become the other, he said. Like you said. Most students hear that instruction and translate it into picture the result very hard. She looked at him with her measuring expression. You did something different. I felt them, he said, then immediately wondered if that sounded ridiculous. McGonagall's expression told him nothing, which with McGonagall meant she was thinking something she hadn't decided to share yet. She moved on, and Harry looked at his needle, and Hermione beside him was making a sound of intense concentration as her match attempted and failed to fully commit to its new identity. You understood it, Harry said quietly. You're overriding its resistance instead of convincing it. Objects don't have resistance, Hermione said, focused. Then what's stopping it? She paused. Tried again differently. The match became a needle, perfect, immediate, not a wood grain in sight. Hermione stared at it. Oh, she said. Yeah, Harry agreed. Charms was Professor Flitwick and the levitation charm and the particular chaos of 20-odd children attempting Wingardium Leviosa for the first time with varying degrees of conviction. Flitwick was a small man with enormous precision who moved through the classroom with the efficiency of someone conducting an experiment he'd run many times and still found genuinely interesting. Harry's feather lifted on the third attempt. On the fourth attempt he held it steady for 30 seconds and then, because he was curious about something, tilted his wrist and sent it in a slow circle around his head. The magic moved exactly where he asked it to. Like having a conversation in a language that was also your first language. What interested him was the wand, the way it was a conduit rather than a source. He could feel the magic moving through it the way you feel a current through water, directed but not created by the wood and core. He spent the last 10 minutes of class testing the limits of that direction. How subtle could he make the instruction, how precise? Pretty subtle. Pretty precise. This seemed like the kind of thing to not do openly in the first week, so he stopped. Neville, 3 seats over, had finally, gotten his feather to twitch, which he seemed to regard as a personal victory of meaningful proportions. Harry said nothing about the feather he'd been orbiting his head with earlier. Some things were about the moment you were in, not the moment someone else was in. Good start, Harry told him. It moved, Neville said. Briefly. I'll take it. You'll take it and build on it, Hermione said firmly, which was her version of warm encouragement, and Neville seemed to understand that. Potions was Snape. Harry had been thinking about this one since the staff room conversation he hadn't heard but had deduced from Ragnarok's letter and several other data points. Snape was intelligent, politically aware, loyal to Dumbledore while being clearly his own person, and had been watching Harry since the sorting with an expression that combined professional assessment with something more personal that Harry didn't have enough context yet to read. He walked into the dungeon classroom and found a seat in the second row, which was a deliberate choice, close enough to see clearly, far enough back to observe the room. Snape arrived with the dramatic efficiency of a man who knew how to use an entrance, robes settling as he turned to face them, black eyes sweeping the classroom with the assessment of a man cataloging new variables in an ongoing experiment. You are here, he said, without preamble, because you survived 1 year of Hogwarts, a pause during which he glanced at his notes, or rather, because you are beginning that year. And potions will determine whether you continue it with any grace. Potions is not wand-waving. It is not the grand theatrical magic that has apparently captured most of your attention. His eyes moved across the class. It is precision. It is patience. It is understanding that the difference between a healing draught and a poison is often a single incorrect ingredient or a stir in the wrong direction. He stopped. Mr. Potter. Professor Snape. A pause. Snape had been expecting a flinch or a performance of attention, Harry suspected, and getting neither, just direct acknowledgement, was marginally disorienting for him. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? Harry considered the question. He'd covered this. Draught of living death, he said. A powerful sleeping potion. The combination of asphodel and wormwood creates a synergistic effect that slows the body's systems to the threshold of clinical death. Potentially reversible if the correct counter potion is administered in time. Snape looked at him for a moment. The class was very quiet. Where would you find a bezoar? Stomach of a goat. It's a calcified mass of indigestible plant material that absorbs certain poisons. Effective antidote for most but not all. It won't work against potions that have already been metabolized into compounds the bezoar can't sequester. Another pause. What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? The same plant, Harry said. Also called aconitum. Context-dependent naming. The silence stretched. Snape's expression was doing something that it was very carefully not doing openly. He had prepared this examination as a ritual humiliation. Harry understood, the questions designed to expose ignorance, to establish hierarchy, to make the famous Harry Potter look small in front of his peers in the first 10 minutes of the first lesson. And Harry had answered correctly, which had not been part of the script. 5 points to Gryffindor, Snape said, with the tone of a man making a decision he wasn't entirely pleased with. Open your textbooks to page 14. You will attempt a simple boil-curing potion. Mr. Potter, his eyes moved back, you will find the process outlined clearly. I suggest you follow it precisely, without innovation. Of course, Harry said. He followed the instructions precisely. His potion was correct. Snape checked it at the end of class and set it back down without comment, which Harry suspected was, from Snape, a form of acknowledgement. On the way out, Ron appeared beside him and said, "He hates you." He doesn't know me well enough to hate me yet, Harry said. He was going to make you look stupid. I know. And you just knew all of it. I read ahead. He glanced at Ron. He was waiting for specific ignorance. The questions were chosen to expose someone who'd been given everything and taken none of it seriously. He paused. Which is apparently what he expected. Ron was quiet for a moment. What he expected from the famous Harry Potter. Yeah. Must be annoying, Ron said, having everyone have a version of you in their head that's wrong. Harry looked at him. Ron had the direct, uncomplicated honesty of someone who hadn't been taught to be strategic about the truth. It was a quality Harry found himself trusting instinctively. It is a bit, he said. But it's useful too. People underestimate you when their expectations are off. You can move in the gap. Ron thought about this. That sounds like something Fred and George would say. High praise, Harry said, and Ron laughed. It was the end of the first week when Harry went exploring. Not the wandering kind, he wasn't lost, he didn't need to stumble onto things. He went exploring in the methodical way he did everything, with a rough map he'd drawn from memory and the castle's magical signature as a secondary guide. He'd been feeling Hogwarts's architecture in the background since he'd arrived, not intrusively, just a low presence, like the castle was generally aware of the people moving through it and generally not bothered. He went up on the third floor, because the third floor was the floor Dumbledore had warned them away from in the opening announcements, which was interesting. The warning had been delivered in the genial, professorial manner of a suggestion rather than a command, which Harry had filed as a thing designed to make certain students burn with curiosity while giving Dumbledore plausible deniability. It was exactly the kind of management Harry recognized from 11 years of people shaping his behavior through implication. He didn't go through the locked door. He stood near it and felt the magic on the other side and made a list of observations, the warming charm that meant something living was generating heat in that corridor, the layered lock enchantments that were good but not exceptional, the smell that came faintly through the door frame that was distinctive in a way he couldn't yet place. He stood there for about 30 seconds, then turned around and walked back down. Well, said Hermione, who had been waiting at the staircase. You followed me, he said. You went to the third floor on a Friday evening with a very purposeful expression. I wanted to see what you'd found. She paused. What did you find? Something alive. Good wards. A smell I don't recognize yet. He started down the stairs. It's not ready to be found. Whatever Dumbledore's using as protection is incomplete, he'd need his full magic for the complete set, and he doesn't have it, so whatever is up there right now is being guarded by the first layer and not much else. Hermione walked beside him, processing. The stone, she said. Harry looked at her. Nicholas Flamel, she said. I've been reading ahead, it's not in the curriculum, but I found a reference in a history of magic and then a more detailed account in, she caught herself. The Philosopher's Stone. Flamel is the only known maker. He lives in Devon. Dumbledore is his close associate. She paused. If Dumbledore needed to store something priceless and potentially targeted and couldn't complete his own protections, he'd improvise, Harry said. Yes. And if someone were trying to steal it, they'd know his defenses were compromised. He stopped at the bottom of the staircase. Hermione. How did you get from a history of magic to Flamel to this in 4 days? She looked at him with the expression of someone who had spent their entire life being told their habit of following every thread until it ended was excessive. It's what I do, she said, simply, a little defensively. I know, he said. I meant it as a compliment. She absorbed this. Oh. You're probably right about the stone. We should know more before we decide what to do about it. He started moving again. Can you find out what Dumbledore's current protective capabilities actually are? Not guessing, actual information. That's not easy to determine. You're not someone who stops at not easy. No, she agreed, and the defensiveness was completely gone now, replaced with the focused energy of a problem she was already turning over. "No, I'm not." He found the mirror of Eriste by accident, which was the only way you found it. The castle moved rooms when it wanted to, and Hogwarts, Harry was increasingly certain, had opinions about where people ended up. It was in an unused classroom on the 6th floor, and he found it at midnight on a Tuesday because he couldn't sleep and had decided that walking was better than lying in the dark overthinking, and the door had been open. The mirror was tall and ornate, and the inscription along the top, Eriste stra eru oit ube kafru oit on wosi, resolved when he reversed it in his head, I show not your face but your heart's desire. He stood in front of it. A woman with red hair and green eyes that were exactly his smiled at him from the glass. A man with black hair standing the same way Harry stood was laughing at something, turned toward the woman, hand raised mid-gesture. They were not looking at Harry, they were existing in their own moment, alive and complete and vivid, and then the woman turned and looked at him directly, and her expression, he stepped back. He stood in the dark classroom with his fists at his sides and his heart doing something complicated, and looked at the mirror for a while longer, and then he looked away. He understood the mirror's danger immediately, not because anyone had explained it but because he could feel it, the pull of it, the way it offered completion, the specific quality of an emptiness being held in front of you and told it could be filled if you just kept looking. He thought about the deference compulsion that had been removed from him and wondered how many years it had taken to install something that the mirror could reinstall in an evening if you let it. He picked up a spare desk cloth that had been folded on a nearby chair, covered the mirror's face without looking at it again, and left. In the corridor outside, he sat with his back against the cold stone and did not think about the woman with his eyes. He allowed himself 2 minutes of not managing it. Felt it properly, the want, the grief, the specific ache of something that had always been missing and now had a shape. Then he assembled himself and stood up. The grief was real. It was his. He'd carry it. But he was not going to build his life facing a mirror. The castle knew where he was. He'd been increasingly certain of this for 2 weeks, and it confirmed itself the following Thursday when he was walking back from the library and found a corridor he hadn't seen before that led, improbably, directly to the Gryffindor common room from a section of the 4th floor where no such corridor had previously existed. He stopped in the middle of it. "Okay," he said, to the corridor and by extension the castle. The stones said nothing, obviously. But there was a quality of attention in the air that he'd come to recognize, the same quality he'd felt from the lake on the first night, the same deep settled presence. "You're watching," he said. The torches didn't flicker. The stones didn't speak. But he had the clear, illogical, entirely certain feeling of being seen. "That's all right," he said. "I'm watching too." He walked the rest of the corridor to the portrait of the fat lady and gave the password and went to bed, and if the castle was smiling somewhere in its deep foundations, he didn't catch it. Neville caught him the next morning with the expression of someone who'd been up too early working something out. "My gran wrote again," he said, dropping into the chair beside Harry at breakfast. "She's heard about what you did at Gringotts. Not from me, she apparently has people." He poured himself pumpkin juice. "She wants to meet you. During term. She's proposing a Hogsmeade visit, except first years can't go to Hogsmeade, which she knows, so she's framing it as an educational meeting and asking McGonagall to make an exception." He said it with a kind of exhausted affection. "She got McGonagall to make an exception last time she tried this. In 1987. It's a documented thing." Harry looked at him. "What do you want?" Neville thought about it honestly, which Harry had noticed was how he did most things, without the social reflexes that made most people just say the smooth thing. "I think you'd understand each other," he said finally. "She's not soft. She says what she means and she expects you to say what you mean back. Most people find it hard." A pause. "I think you'd find it easy." "Then tell her yes," Harry said. "She's also going to ask you about the Lordships." "Good. I have questions about the political structure anyway. Your grandmother knows more about the Wisengamot than any published source I've read." Neville stared at him. That's not the reaction I expected. What did you expect? Mild apprehension. She's a lot. Neville, Harry said, I was raised by people who actively resented my existence. An opinionated grandmother who reads political situations for breakfast doesn't intimidate me in the slightest. Neville opened his mouth, closed it, and said, I'm writing back today. The first real magic Harry did that surprised him happened in Charms, which was appropriate because Charms was the class that kept making him want to push beyond the curriculum's edges. They were working on the basic shield charm, ahead of schedule. Flitwick had noted with barely concealed enthusiasm, because this particular class had taken to wand work with unusual facility, and Harry had the charm working solidly after 10 minutes, which left him with 30 minutes of class and a question. The shield charm blocked physical and magical impact. It was reactive, you cast it and it sat there as a barrier until it was broken or released. He'd read the theory, which described it as a static magical construct. But static constructs wasted energy in proportion to what they weren't doing. A constant shield burning magic to maintain itself against nothing was an inefficiency that the textbooks just accepted as inherent. He tried something different. Instead of casting the shield as a barrier, he cast it as a response, a charm primed to activate on contact rather than maintained against possibility. It was theoretically more complex but practically more efficient, the way a pressure switch was more efficient than a light left permanently on. He tapped it with his wand to test. The shield snapped up, deflected the tap's force, and dissipated. He tried it against Hermione's charm, which she was directing at a target dummy across the room. His shield caught the charm, turned it, and released. The whole thing took a fraction of a second and cost him about a quarter of the magical energy the standard version would have. Flitwick had been watching. Mr. Potter, he said, in the voice of someone trying to sound merely interested and not deeply excited. What was that? Responsive variant, Harry said. Primed activation instead of sustained barrier. More efficient, should be comparable in deflection capability. Flitwick was now making the face of a man who had just seen a student do in 30 minutes of free experimentation what took most adult wizards years of deliberate study to figure out. Have you encountered this in your reading? No. I worked it out from the energy cost principles in Theoretical Charms Chapter 4. Chapter 4, Flitwick repeated faintly. Which is, third-year curriculum, Harry said. But the theory applies at any level. Flitwick looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he brightened, genuinely brightened, the specific joy of a teacher encountering a student whose curiosity had outrun the course. 10 points to Gryffindor. And Mr. Potter, I'd like you to come to my office hours on Thursday. Of course, Professor. Bring your theoretical framework. I have questions. Harry nodded, and Hermione, beside him, was already leaning over to look at what he'd been working through on his parchment with the focused attention of someone identifying a better path. Show me, she said. He showed her. She had the responsive variant working in 12 minutes, which was frankly impressive, and then she started pushing it further and Harry started pushing back, and by the end of class they developed a version that could differentiate between aggressive and incidental contact without breaking, which Flitwick watched from the front of the room with the expression of a man in the presence of a beautiful problem being solved. The conversation about Dumbledore happened naturally, because most important conversations happen naturally, they find the right moment and settle into it without requiring a formal setting. Harry was in the library with Neville and Hermione on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks into term, working through a transfiguration essay that was technically due Friday but that all three of them were finishing Wednesday because they'd agreed early on that leaving essays to the last day created suboptimal thinking conditions. Hermione had found the information about Dumbledore's magical capabilities through a route Harry found impressive. She'd cross-referenced incident reports in the school records room, which she'd been given access to by Madame Pants after a 40-minute conversation about archival methodology, against staff meeting minutes from the last month, and compared those against the practical magic she'd observed him perform or, more relevantly, not perform. He's had his magic for 6 weeks by now, she said quietly, because the library required quiet and Hermione respected the rules of spaces she loved. The initial loss was apparently total. Based on what I can determine, some minor capabilities have returned. I saw him light a candle without a wand gesture last week, which suggests basic accidental magic has come back. But structured spell casting, she paused. He cast a simple Alohomora last week and it took him 4 attempts. I was in the corridor. His magic is coming back but slowly, Harry said. Like rebuilding a muscle after a significant injury, she agreed. Neville had been listening with his essay quill still in hand. What happened to it in the first place? Does anyone know? The official version is an illness, Hermione said. The actual version, she looked at Harry. Compact dissolution, Harry said. His family's power was partly tied to the Potter line. When I walked away from the Lordships, I dissolved the compact. He paused. I didn't know it would do that. Ragnarok's letter mentioned it afterward. A silence. That's not your fault, Neville said carefully. I know. He did know. The compulsions, the monitoring charm, the managed circumstances of his entire life, Dumbledore had done those things with intention and Harry had not been consulted. The compact consequence was an old magic's response to a broken agreement, and Harry hadn't been party to the agreement in the first place. But he sat with it anyway, the fact of it, because ignoring consequences because they weren't your fault was how you became someone who didn't understand what they did in the world. What does it mean for, Neville stopped, organizing his thought. The protections. The third-floor corridor. Whatever Dumbledore's doing up there, if his magic is weakened, his protections are weakened, Hermione finished. Whatever's up there is more vulnerable than it was supposed to be. She looked at Harry. Someone might know that. Someone does know that, Harry said. Who? He thought about Quirrell. The particular performance of his nervousness. The way his attention moved in a room, always aware of Harry, always aware of Dumbledore, always subtly calculating distances. I'm not sure yet, he said. I'm still watching. That's not reassuring, Hermione said. It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be accurate. He looked at them both. We pay attention. We learn what we need to learn. When it becomes necessary to do something, we do it. He paused. We don't run to teachers and we don't panic and we don't try to solve a problem we don't fully understand yet. Shouldn't we tell someone? Neville asked. Tell who? Harry said. The headmaster who put whatever it is there with protections he can currently barely maintain. Snape, who's watching Quirrell on Dumbledore's instruction and has his own agenda. McGonagall, who's been running this school single-handed for weeks and is holding things together on competence and willpower. He looked at the table. They're all doing what they can. So will we. Neville absorbed this. Then, what do you need us to do? Hermione keeps finding information. You keep me honest about the political side, you know this world better than I do. He looked at both of them. And we all keep being students, because the best thing we can do right now is learn. That's not as dramatic as I expected, Neville said. Most good plans aren't dramatic, Harry said. Drama means you waited too long. The Quidditch tryout happened on a Saturday in mid-October, and Harry hadn't planned to go. He had no particular attachment to Quidditch in the abstract, he'd read about it, found the game interesting as a spatial problem, and wasn't especially drawn to the social performance of it. Oliver Wood had announced tryouts with the evangelical fervor of a man whose entire personality had organized itself around a sport at an early age, and Harry had listened politely and gone back to his book. Ron grabbed his arm on Saturday morning. Just come and watch, Ron said. You don't have to try out. I have reading, the reading will still exist this afternoon. He was already pulling. Fred and George are on the team, it'll be good. It was not exactly good and exactly not planned the way it turned out. Harry had been standing at the sideline watching the Seeker tryout, 3 Gryffindors making reasonable attempts at a practice snitch, when one of them overcorrected on a dive and sent his broom sideways and the practice snitch, released improperly, shot directly toward the face of a second-year boy standing on the ground near Harry. Harry caught it. Not with a broom, he was standing on the ground, just reached up and closed his fist around it as it passed, smooth and entirely without drama. The snitch buzzed against his palm. He opened his hand and looked at it. "Right," said Oliver Wood, descending immediately from overhead with the expression of a man whose birthday and Christmas had arrived simultaneously. "Right. You. First year." "What, I just caught it," Harry said. "On the ground. Without a broom. Do you have any idea?" Wood was already off his broom and beside him, speaking at considerable speed. "You have to try out. You have to. There's a rule against first-year students," Harry said. "McGonagall can make exceptions, I know she can," Harry said. "I'll think about it." Wood made a strangled sound. Harry pocketed the snitch, he'd hand it back in a moment, and looked at the sky, at the 3 students on brooms still circling, and felt the pull of it. The open air, the speed of the thing, the pure spatial joy of it. He'd felt it from the boats crossing the lake, had recognized it as a part of himself he hadn't had access to. He handed the snitch back to Wood. "Set up a proper tryout," he said. "One-on-one with your best seeker. If I can do it on a broom what I just did on the ground, I'll consider it." "Consider it," Wood repeated, as if the word was in a language he barely spoke. "I'll consider it seriously," Harry said. "But I'm not going to join the team because I happen to catch something. I want to know I'm actually good at it, not just that I got lucky once." Fred, hovering nearby, said to George, "Did he just make Wood audition him?" "I think he just made Wood audition him," George confirmed. Ron was grinning broadly. "Told you it'd be good," he said. 2 days later, Quirrell sat down beside Harry at breakfast. Not aggressively, there was nothing overt about it. He simply chose the seat adjacent at the Gryffindor table during a quiet morning moment and said, in his usual fluttering manner, "Mr. Peapotter. Settling in well, I hope." "Very well," Harry said, setting down his pumpkin juice. "The castle can be overwhelming at first." "The history of it," Quirrell made a vague gesture, "so much history." "You've been exploring, I understand." Harry looked at him. "Have I? Students always do. It's natural." He smiled, and the smile had the quality of something practiced in a mirror. "The 3rd floor in particular. Students always find it interesting despite the headmaster's warning." "Naturally," Harry said. "You're a curious boy." The stammer was present, but underneath the stammer was something smoother, something that didn't stammer at all. "Your curiosity must be quite developed. Given everything." "What's under the turban?" Harry asked. Complete silence. Quirrell's hands on the table went still. He asked it the way he asked everything, directly, without aggression, with the simple attention of someone who had decided to move the conversation to where it actually was rather than where it was pretending to be. He'd smelled the wrongness on Quirrell for weeks. The turbaned head that sometimes turned of its own accord when Quirrell was distracted. The particular way his magical signature had a second thread in it, thinner and colder and much older. Quirrell looked at him with a face that had several things happening on it at once. "I beg your pardon," he managed. "The turban," Harry said. "It always smells faintly of garlic, which is an interesting protective choice, and you tend to hold your head very still when someone approaches from behind. The stammer started this September. It wasn't in your previous teaching records, which I found in the school archive." He paused. "I'm not trying to embarrass you. I'm trying to understand what I'm dealing with." Quirrell's face had gone through several colors. He started. "I know something's there," Harry said quietly. "I don't know exactly what yet. But I know you've been watching me since the sorting, and I know you've been testing me since breakfast on Thursday. The specific questions you've been putting near me in conversations, they're calibrated." He set down his pumpkin juice. "So. What do you want?" The turban turned. "Just slightly." In the direction of a decision being made. Then Quirrell said, in a voice that was completely his own, without stammer, "You are not what we expected." "I know," Harry said. He picked up his juice again. "Nobody I've met so far has been what they expected either. We're all finding out." He looked at Quirrell steadily. "Whatever you're planning, I'd recommend patience. The stone is better protected than you currently think." It was a guess, partly a read of available information. But Quirrell's expression confirmed it absolutely, and Harry filed the confirmation and stood up from the table. "Good morning, Professor," he said, and walked to class with his bag over his shoulder and his heart beating completely steadily. Behind him, Quirrell sat very still at the Gryffindor table, and underneath the turban, something very old and very cold turned this development over in its mind with the first genuine uncertainty it had felt in a decade. Chapter 4, The Weight of Empty Chairs. Augusta Longbottom arrived on a Thursday. She came through the front gates at 10:30 in the morning with the bearing of a woman who had never once in her life required an invitation to go anywhere, wearing her usual vulture-topped hat and robes that were somewhere between formal and militaristic. McGonagall met her at the entrance hall, which was either courtesy or containment, and the two women shook hands with the precise formality of people who respected each other and had strong opinions about different things. Harry watched from the staircase above. "She looks like she could win a war by sheer force of expression," Hermione said from beside him. "She did," Neville said, appearing on Harry's other side. 1979, she personally convinced 4 Wizengamot members to change their votes on the Magical Creatures Protection Act by showing up unannounced at each of their houses on a Sunday morning. He said it with the tone of someone who had heard this story enough times that it had transcended anecdote and become geography. "She's been doing that her whole life." "What did she do with the ones who didn't change their votes?" Harry asked. "Made their lives extremely inconvenient until the next session." A pause. "She's creative about inconvenience." McGonagall was leading Augusta toward the small meeting room off the entrance hall, and Augusta was saying something that made McGonagall's expression do a complicated thing where it almost became a smile before it remembered itself. "Right," Harry said. "Let's go." The meeting room had a fire going and a tea service that hadn't been there yesterday, which meant either McGonagall had arranged it or the house elves had opinions about important meetings. Augusta Longbottom was standing when they entered, which Harry suspected she did always. Standing gave you the room in a way sitting didn't, and Augusta Longbottom was not someone who gave rooms away unnecessarily. She looked at Neville first, a long, assessing look that had real love in it and also real expectation, the two things layered so completely that you couldn't separate them, and then she looked at Harry. "So," she said. "Mrs. Longbottom," Harry said. "I expected someone taller." "I'm still growing," Harry said. Her eyes sharpened. Then, surprisingly, briefly, she smiled. "Sit down," she said, with the tone of someone who has just decided a meeting is worth having. "I'll pour." She poured with the efficiency of a woman who had attended so many political meetings that tea preparation had become an unconscious demonstration of control, who got served first, how full the cup, whether milk was offered or assumed. She poured Harry's first, which he noted. Then Neville's. Then her own. She sat only after everyone else was seated. "You refused 22 lordships," she said, without preamble. "Yes. Including Gryffindor and Slytherin, which between them would have given you more raw political leverage in the Wizengamot than any individual since Dumbledore built his current coalition." She said current with the very slight emphasis of someone who had noticed the coalition was looking somewhat less current than it used to. "Yes." "Why?" "Not a question exactly. A demand for an accounting." Harry set down his cup. "Because they weren't mine. I didn't earn them and I don't want to govern things I don't understand. And because accepting them would have meant becoming the thing that people had been arranging me to become for 11 years, and I'm not interested in being arranged." Augusta regarded him. "Political power isn't something you earn," she said. "It's something you inherit and exercise. That's how it's always worked." "I know how it's always worked," Harry said. I read 3 books on it before September. He looked at her steadily. How it's always worked isn't an argument for how it should work. It's just a description of the past. You sound like a reformer, she said. I sound like someone who had compulsion charms removed from his nervous system by Gringotts goblins 6 weeks ago, Harry said. I'm interested in making sure that doesn't happen again. To me or anyone else. The room was very quiet for a moment. Augusta set down her own cup with great deliberateness. Those are serious allegations. They're documented by Gringotts. Ragnarok oversaw the removal personally. The binding records are in my account file. He paused. Albus Dumbledore's magical signature was on 2 of the 3. Neville was very still beside Harry. He hadn't known this part, not the specifics, not the named signature. Harry had told him there were compulsions and that they were gone, but the full accounting he'd kept to himself until there was a reason to share it. There was a reason now. Augusta's face did something complicated. She was not a woman who performed shock easily, but this moved behind her eyes like weather moving across a plain, fast, large, genuinely disruptive. Albus, she said. The name had weight to it. Old weight. Personal history. He believed it was necessary, Harry said. Not defending, just completing the picture. He needed things to go a specific way. I was supposed to be the instrument of that. The compulsions were, management. Making sure the instrument was calibrated correctly. He picked up his tea. I don't hate him for it. He was working from a very long-term plan and genuinely thought it served the greater good. People who believe in the greater good do terrible things with excellent intentions. Augusta was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her yet, something that was less assessment and more simply recognition. Like meeting someone you'd been hearing described inaccurately for a long time and finding that the reality was different in ways that mattered. What do you want? She asked. Right now. Education. He meant it simply. I want to learn how this world works, the real version, not the managed version. I want to understand the political structure, the old compacts, what's actually being contested and why. He glanced at Neville. I want my friends to have the space to figure out who they are rather than who they're supposed to be. He looked back at Augusta. And I want whoever is currently trying to steal a highly dangerous magical artifact from the 3rd floor of this school to not succeed, because that situation is going to become a problem within the next 6 months and the person officially responsible for handling it is currently rebuilding his magic from scratch. Augusta stared at him. He's like this all the time, Neville said, with the air of someone providing context. Neville told me you know the Wizengamot's actual composition better than any published source, Harry said. I need to understand who Lucius Malfoy is building coalitions with, and why the Slytherin Lordship specifically is worth contesting rather than the 12 other unclaimed titles I walked away from. I have a theory but I want to check it against someone who actually knows. Augusta was silent for 5 full seconds, which was, Harry suspected, unusual for her. The Slytherin Lordship, she said slowly, comes with a seat on the Wizengamot's old family's council that has been dormant since you-know-who's first rise. Whoever claims it can reactivate the seat. Combined with the Malfoy seat and 2 allied families Lucius has been cultivating since the trials, she stopped. You've read the political history. Enough of it. The Slytherin seat gives Malfoy a qualified majority on the old family's council for the first time since 1981, she said. Which means he can push through at least 4 pieces of inheritance and creature rights legislation that Dumbledore's coalition has been blocking for 7 years. She looked at Harry with new intensity. You understood this when you withdrew your claim. I understood it was possible, Harry said. I needed your confirmation on the specific mechanism. You are 11 years old, Augusta said. I had a very quiet summer, Harry said. Neville made a sound that was technically a cough. Augusta looked at her grandson. Really looked at him, not the assessing look of inventory, the look of someone seeing a person. You're all right? She asked, and it was softer than anything else she'd said. Yeah, Gran, Neville said. Yeah. I'm good. He said it with the particular quality of something genuinely meant rather than performed. I'm figuring things out. She looked at him for a moment longer, and something shifted in her posture, not a collapse of it, she was structurally incapable of collapsing her posture, but a slight easing, like a door opened to a room that was warmer than expected. I'll write you a letter, she told Harry. About the Wiesengemot. The current composition and the political geometry. She stood, which meant the meeting was over because she had decided the meeting was over. I'll also be making some inquiries about certain institutional decisions. Documented institutional decisions. She said it in the voice of someone who had just loaded a very large weapon and hadn't yet decided on the target. Mrs. Longbottom, Harry said. Be careful. Whoever documented those decisions is currently more vulnerable than he was, and vulnerable people make unpredictable choices. She looked at him sharply. You're concerned about Dumbledore. I'm concerned about anyone in a difficult position who has decades of habit telling them that they're the one who should be solving problems. He paused. I'm not his enemy. I don't want to be. But his version of helping has historically involved arrangements I wasn't consulted on, and right now he's in a position where that might escalate. Augusta regarded him for one more long moment. Then she put on her hat, a definitive gesture, the hat of a woman departing, and said, I see why Neville writes so warmly about you. She left. McGonagall appeared in the doorway to see her out, and Harry heard them talking in low voices in the entrance hall, and he thought he heard McGonagall say something that ended with remarkable before the front doors closed. Neville let out a long breath. That's the most she's spoken to anyone other than me in about 3 years, he said. She's very contained, usually. Politically. She's deciding something, Harry said. We should make sure she has good information when she decides it. She'll write to you, Neville said. She said she would. She doesn't say things she doesn't mean. I know. Harry picked up the last of his tea. That's why I asked. Quidditch practice started without him, which was Oliver Wood's passive-aggressive response to Harry's qualified yes. Harry let it go for 2 weeks, attended his classes, finished his essay on memory charms for charms, wrote back to Ragnarok about the Malfoy inheritance challenge with 3 questions he wanted answers to, and on a wet Tuesday evening went down to the Quidditch pitch at dusk with a Nimbus 2000 that would have provisioned under the apparent theory that having the broom available would be persuasive. It was. He'd ridden brooms twice on the grounds, the mandatory flying class, which Madame Hooch ran with firm professionalism and in which Harry had discovered immediately that brooms felt like an extension of himself in the air in a way he hadn't fully anticipated from reading about it. Reading about flight was comprehensively inadequate preparation for flight. This was worth knowing. He flew for an hour in the rain without anyone watching. The Nimbus was responsive in the way that good equipment is responsive, not by doing anything remarkable on its own but by not getting in the way of what he asked it to do. He went fast because fast felt right. He went high because the view from above the castle at dusk was extraordinary, the peaks and towers of Hogwarts laid out below him in the rain like something from a different scale of existence. He found the thing he'd been looking for about 40 minutes in. Not looking for consciously, he hadn't known what to call it until it was there. A quality of attention that opened when he was in the air, different from the attention he applied to books or conversations or strategies. Clean and present and entirely without background noise. The sky didn't have politics. The broom didn't have an agenda. The rain was just rain. He stayed up until he couldn't see properly, and then he flew down and stood in the wet grass with the broom and felt quiet. The kind of quiet that was actually rest rather than the absence of noise. He told Wood yes in the morning. The letter from Ragnarok came back with answers that confirmed Harry's theory about the Slytherin lordship and added 3 pieces of information he hadn't had. The first was that Lucius Malfoy had been making inquiries about Harry's financial situation with the apparent assumption that Harry might be purchasable if approached correctly, which Harry found both insulting and useful to know. The second was that the challenge had attracted 3 other interested parties, which meant the Slytherin seat was more valuable to more people than even Augusta had indicated. The third, he read the third piece twice. The Gaunt family vault, previously sealed pending your claim, was open for independent assessment following your refusal. Content has been forwarded to Gringotts Central Records. We thought you should know that among the inventory was a document, dated 1944, that appears to be a communication between Tom Marvolo Riddle and a Gringotts account manager regarding an inquiry into the Gaunt inheritance. We are determining the appropriate course of action regarding this document. Your thoughts, if you have them, would be welcome. Tom Riddle had tried to claim the Gaunt inheritance in 1944. Before Voldemort. Before the name. A 16-year-old at Hogwarts reaching for old blood and old power and finding the mechanism of it, the same mechanism Harry had just walked away from. He thought about that for a while. The symmetry of it was uncomfortable. Two boys, both unusual, both powerful, both arriving at Gringotts at points of inheritance, making opposite choices. He didn't like the comparison. He didn't think it was meaningless. He wrote back to Ragnarok, keep the document secure. Don't share it yet. When the time is right, I'll want to see it. Thank you. Dumbledore found Harry in the library on a Friday afternoon in November, which Harry had been expecting for approximately 2 weeks. He walked in with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been rebuilding his physical presence, not his magical one, that was still largely absent, but the other presence, the quality that had nothing to do with spells and everything to do with the accumulated weight of how he'd been in rooms for 100 years. He was still impressive without his magic. Just differently so. Smaller in a way that was more real. He sat down across the table from Harry with a consideration that acknowledged what had changed between them. The twinkle was present but diminished. The eyes were still sharp, but they had the quality of eyes that had been doing a lot of looking inward lately. Harry, he said. Professor, Harry said. Headmaster, technically, Dumbledore said, then added, though that title has felt rather more theoretical than usual of late. Harry set down his book. He didn't perform the deference reflex, the old compulsion's ghost, reaching for a response that was no longer installed. Just looked at Dumbledore with the attention he gave everyone, direct and without judgment but without softness either. I owe you an apology, Dumbledore said. Yes, Harry said. Dumbledore's eyes moved slightly, not hurt, something more complicated. He'd been expecting, perhaps, a more resistant response. Something that gave him more to work against. I'm not certain how to offer it appropriately, he said. The actions were numerous and the justifications I applied to them were, he paused. I find they hold up less well under examination than they did when I constructed them. You put compulsion charms on an infant, Harry said. Not a spell of the moment. You made a deliberate, considered decision to shape someone's personality and capabilities to serve your plan. He wasn't angry, the flat recitation of it was more honest than anger would have been. The plan may have been good. The intention may have been good. The action was still a violation. Yes, Dumbledore said quietly. And you knew. For 10 years you knew where I was living and what my life was, and you decided that the difficult circumstances served the plan too. Kept me small and uncertain and grateful for whatever attention I got. He watched Dumbledore's face. That's the part that's harder to explain with good intentions. Dumbledore was silent for a moment. The fire in the library's main hearth made its soft sounds. Outside, November rain moved against the windows. It is harder, Dumbledore said. I told myself that adversity builds character. That protected comfort produces complacency. That you needed, he stopped. I was explaining myself to myself. There was a child in a cupboard and I made administrative decisions about the greater necessity of his remaining there. He set his hands on the table. They were just hands now, no wand, nothing to reach for. I don't know how to make that right. You can't, Harry said. Not retroactively. No. But you can decide what you do next. Harry looked at him. What I want from you, not as a demand, just as what would actually be useful, is information. What you know about the stone on the third floor, about Quirrell, about the prophecy you've been working from. Not managed information. The actual situation. Dumbledore was very still. You know I know about the prophecy, Harry said. You had a monitoring charm on me for 10 years. You know what I've found out and when. He tilted his head. What I don't have is your version. Your actual strategic picture. Because I might need it. Why would you need it? Dumbledore asked, and it wasn't dismissive, it was genuinely curious, the curiosity of a man encountering a perspective he hadn't oriented around. Because Quirrell spoke to me at breakfast 3 weeks ago, Harry said. In his own voice. The stammer dropped. Dumbledore went very still. What did he say? That I wasn't what they expected. And then he confirmed indirectly that it's the stone he's after. Harry looked at him. Whoever is in that turban has been communicating with Quirrell for months. The cold signature in his magical field, it's old. Older than Quirrell. Significantly more powerful. He paused. You know what it is. I suspect, Dumbledore said. Tell me. Another silence. Dumbledore looked at Harry with the expression of a man crossing a threshold he hadn't been sure he'd reach. Then, I believe Lord Voldemort, and he said the name simply, without drama, reduced to a wraith state following his failed attempt to kill you, has attached himself to Quirrell as a host. He needs the stone to restore himself to a body. He paused. The prophecy, I won't recite it. But its implication was that you and he are bound by a connection that will require one of you to destroy the other before it can end. And your plan was to keep me sufficiently obedient that I'd walk into that when the time came. The fire popped. Rain against windows. Yes, Dumbledore said. The word cost him something. That was the plan. It's not the plan anymore, Harry said. Not a question. I confess, Dumbledore said, that I'm no longer certain what the plan should be. I am a man of strategy and I find myself without either the tools or the certainty that my previous strategy deserves to continue. He looked at Harry with genuine and unmanaged honesty. I am also, Harry, very much afraid of what happens if Voldemort returns and there is no plan in place. Then we need a better plan, Harry said. Not yours. Not mine. Something built from the actual situation. And you think we can build that? I think you know things I don't and I know things you don't, and between us we might have something workable. He picked up his book again. But it starts with you actually telling me things instead of arranging them. I'm not an instrument. I'll help because I want to, and I'll help better if I understand why. Dumbledore sat with that for a long moment. Then he said, the stone is in a chamber below the third floor. There are 7 protective layers. Without my magic at full capacity, 3 of those layers are currently functioning at perhaps 60% of their designed efficacy. He paused. Quirrell has been systematically testing the defenses for 2 months. He has gotten through 2 of the 7. Which layers? Dumbledore looked at him with the particular look of someone adjusting their understanding of a person in real time. Then he said, the troll and the devil's snare. He has the skill for most of what follows. What he can't easily pass is the chess game, the enchanted pieces require significant tactical intelligence, and the final protection, the flame and logic puzzle, which Quirrell is capable of solving but which slows him. He paused. He'll make a genuine attempt during the Christmas holiday when most students have gone home and the castle is at reduced staff. Christmas holiday, Harry said. 6 weeks. Approximately. Then we have 6 weeks to make those protections better. He looked at Dumbledore. Can your magic support that? Possibly. With time. Can Snape support it? He knows about Quirrell. You asked him to watch. Dumbledore's expression registered something. You know about that conversation. I deduced it. Snape's been keeping himself between Quirrell and the corridor entrance during Quidditch matches. That's not coincidental positioning. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Severus is complicated in this situation. His history with Voldemort creates both motivation and complication. I know, Harry said. I've been watching him all term. He paused. He's reliable. I don't think his loyalty is in question. I think his methodology is occasionally his own worst enemy, but his actual commitment to keeping Voldemort from returning is genuine and personal. He said it without qualification. He's an asset. You've been watching my staff, Dumbledore said. I've been paying attention, Harry said. Which is what I do when the people responsible for my safety have unknown quantities in play. He set his book down again. Talk to Snape. Get the three of us in a room. We build a containment plan for the Christmas period and beyond, and we do it with actual information instead of everyone working from their own partial version. Harry, Dumbledore said, and his voice had something new in it, something that wasn't strategy, wasn't management, wasn't the calculus of greater goods and necessary sacrifices. Just, I'm sorry. For the cupboard. For the years of it. I am genuinely, entirely sorry. Harry looked at him. He found, checking carefully, that he believed it. Not as redemption, one conversation didn't do that. But as a true thing, honestly offered, without an agenda attached to it for once. A man with no magic and no leverage saying something real. I know, Harry said. We'll see what comes next. The Quidditch match against Slytherin was on November 21st and was the first time Harry flew competitively, which was immediately a completely different thing from flying alone at dusk. The crowd made noise and the players made noise and the weather was cold and cutting, and Harry spent the first 2 minutes of the match simply acclimating to the dimension of it, not overwhelmed, just recalibrating, setting the crowd noise as background the same way he set classroom noise as background and finding the game inside it. Slytherin's seeker was a fourth-year named Higgs who had 2 years of experience and a Nimbus 2001, slightly better than Harry's 2000, and who had been briefed, Harry suspected, to play physically close to Harry to rattle him. Higgs was beside him within 30 seconds, close enough that Harry could hear his breathing. Harry didn't look at him. He looked at the sky, scanning the game space with the three-dimensional attention he'd been developing for 3 weeks. The snitch moved in irregular patterns that weren't actually random, there was a logic to how it navigated, influenced by sound levels and movement and the presence of other balls. He'd read the analysis in a tactical text he'd found in the Quidditch section of the library and had thought it was overly theoretical until now, when he could see the pattern in it. 7 minutes in, he saw the snitch. Above the goalposts at the north end, threading through the uprights, not hiding, just passing through. He went. The Nimbus opened up immediately, and Higgs was 2 seconds behind him at the start and 3 seconds behind him at the end, which was how it worked when someone had been born to this and someone else was simply good at it. Harry felt Higgs's wake as he passed, the slipstream, the cold air, the roar of the crowd building from below, and closed his hand around the snitch at 20 feet above the goalposts, clear and clean, and spun the broom to stop before he could overshoot. The roar was physical. He floated down through it with the snitch in his fist, and the thing he felt wasn't triumph exactly, it was deeper, quieter, the particular satisfaction of doing something you were built for and knowing it. Fred and George arrived from either side like a coordinated missile strike of celebration. Ron was somewhere below screaming. Neville had apparently fallen off the stands in excitement and seemed fine. Hermione, he would learn later, had knocked her neighbor's hat off accidentally in her response to the dive and spent the last 30 seconds of the match apologizing. Oliver Wood landed beside him and said, in a voice stripped down to its genuine emotional core, "You're the best I've ever seen." "I'll get better," Harry said. Wood looked at him. "I know," he said. "That's the terrifying part." Draco Malfoy was waiting outside the changing rooms after, which was unexpected enough that Harry stopped. Draco looked like someone who had rehearsed a conversation and wasn't sure how to start it now that the moment was here. His 2 usual companions weren't with him, which meant this was his own choice rather than a performance. "Good match," he said. "Thanks." A pause. "My father came to Hogwarts last week. To meet with Dumbledore." He said it carefully, feeling out the information's weight as he offered it. "Except Dumbledore he's not well, everyone knows that, so McGonagall took the meeting. My father was angry about it. He said," he stopped. "What?" Harry said. "He said that without Dumbledore functioning, the structure protecting certain things is compromised. He seemed pleased about that." Draco looked at the ground briefly. "He's been very interested in what's happening at this school lately." Harry looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," he stopped again. "Pushed through it. Because I came here expecting the wizarding world to be a specific thing and I'm finding out it's different from what I was told, and I don't like some of what I'm finding out about who's involved in which things." He said it quickly, like ripping something off. "My father is involved in things. And I am not," he said, with more firmness than most 12-year-olds could have managed, "going to be involved in those things." Harry looked at him for a long moment. Draco Malfoy, standing alone outside a Quidditch changing room in November, telling Harry his father's business because he'd decided it was the right thing to do. He was performing a little, the pride was still up, the chin was still at the Malfoy angle, but underneath the performance was something genuine and distinctly uncomfortable with itself. "Okay," Harry said. "Thank you. That's it? Just, okay. You told me something useful. I'm telling you I heard it." Harry tilted his head. "If you find out more, and if you want to tell me more, I'll listen." He paused. "You don't owe me anything, Draco. But if you're figuring out who you want to be," he shrugged, "that's a good start." Draco looked at him with the expression he'd had in Madame Malkin's, complicated, working something out, not yet at the conclusion. "You don't do what I expect," he said. "Most people keep saying that," Harry said. "I'm starting to think the expectations were just wrong." He went into the changing room, and behind him he heard Draco make a sound that was almost a laugh, reluctant, surprised, before his footsteps retreated toward the castle. The Ministry Owl found Harry at dinner. Not an unusual occurrence, Post arrived at dinner for everyone. But a Ministry Owl was distinctive, grey, official, delivering a sealed document with the Ministry seal in burgundy wax. He opened it at the table with the pragmatic approach he'd adopted for potentially unwelcome correspondence. It was from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, signed by a name he didn't recognize, formally notifying him that his Gringotts records had been accessed under a department inquiry into alleged irregularities in the management of certain magical estates, and that he might be asked to provide a statement at a future date. He read it twice. "Ministry investigation," Hermione said, reading upside down with the ease of someone who had been reading in suboptimal conditions her whole life. "Into estate management." That's Dumbledore's compulsion charms," Harry said quietly. "Someone filed something." He looked at the letter. "Augusta." Neville was very still. "Gran said she was making inquiries." "She's making considerably more than inquiries," Hermione said. Harry folded the letter. On one level this was a complication. It would pull attention toward him and toward Dumbledore and toward the events of August at a moment when he'd rather keep that background. On another level, what had been done to him was real and documented, and it was entirely right that someone with the standing to file it had filed it. He hadn't asked Augusta to do it. She'd done it because it was the right thing to do, and she was someone who did right things with or without permission. He put the letter in his bag. At the head table, McGonagall had received the same notification. He could tell by the quality of her stillness, the particular kind that meant she was processing something significant while refusing to allow it to affect her visible composure. She set the letter down with great deliberateness and continued eating. Harry looked at Dumbledore's empty chair. He'd been eating in his office since October, which the school had accepted as the continuation of his recovery. The chair sat between McGonagall and Flitwick like a held breath. "Harry," Ron said from beside him, who had been watching the ministry letter with the curiosity of someone who couldn't read upside down but had read everyone's expressions instead. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Harry said. He looked at Ron, earnest, clear-eyed, entirely himself at all times. It was a quality that Harry found more valuable the longer he spent around it. "Yeah, Ron, I'm fine. Ministry stuff. Ministry stuff. My dad would say those two words explain about 80% of all complicated situations," Ron said sagely. "Your dad sounds right about most things," Harry said. Ron grinned. "Don't tell him that. His hat won't fit." Harry laughed. It was a real laugh, not the short, surprised kind from Gringotts, but the full kind, easy and warm, rising out of him without any management involved. Hermione, across the table, looked up from her book and smiled at the sound of it. Chapter 5, The Language of Fire. Christmas arrived at Hogwarts the way it always did, with snow on the grounds, enchanted decorations in the Great Hall, and a substantial thinning of the student population as the majority headed home for the holidays. The castle felt different with fewer people in it. Not empty exactly, but quieter in a way that changed the acoustics, like a concert hall between performances. Harry stayed. He'd written to the Dursleys, a brief, courteous note informing them that he would not be returning for the holiday, which he suspected they received with significant relief. He wrote to Ragnarok about 3 open questions he'd been building toward, and he wrote to Augusta Longbottom thanking her for the ministry filing, which she wrote back about in a letter that was 6 pages long and constituted the most detailed political briefing he'd received yet, including a breakdown of who in the Wisengamot had responded to the news of the filing and how, which told him a great deal about where various people actually stood. Ron stayed because his parents were visiting Charlie in Romania and Percy had prefect duties, and Fred and George claimed the castle at Christmas was superior to the Burrow because of the food, which was either true or a cover story and possibly both. Neville went home to Augusta. Hermione went home to her parents, who she clearly missed in a way that was simple and clean and good. She'd pressed a book into Harry's hands on the platform, not from the curriculum, something she'd found in the library's rarely accessed 4th level. "It's about magical resonance," she said. "I thought you'd find the 3rd chapter relevant to what you've been developing in charms. The responsive shield variant." She'd been brisk about it, the way she was brisk about things that mattered to her. "I made notes in the margins. Some of them are questions rather than answers, so I'll write back with answers," Harry said. She'd looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who had been systematically surprised by a person for 4 months and still hadn't gotten used to it. "Happy Christmas, Harry." "You too, Hermione." He'd watched the train pull away and then gone back up to the castle with the book under his arm and settled into the quiet. He spent the first 3 days of the holiday preparing. The plan he and Dumbledore had developed over 2 meetings in November, with Snape present for the second one, which had been interesting in the way that rooms with high concentrations of intelligence and conflicting personal histories were always interesting, had 3 components. The first was reinforcing the protective layers below the 3rd floor, which Dumbledore and Snape were handling through careful collaborative spellwork on the layers Dumbledore's depleted magic couldn't maintain alone. The second was monitoring Quirrell's movements during the holiday period, which Snape had taken on with the focused efficiency of a man who had been waiting for a concrete task. The third was Harry. Harry's role, as he'd defined it himself, Dumbledore had been notably careful not to define it for him, having apparently learned something about what happened when he did that, was to know the chamber well enough to operate in it if everything else failed. So he went down. He told Dumbledore he was going. Dumbledore had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Be careful," which was the kind of thing you said when you'd run out of alternatives to trusting someone. Harry had nodded and gone. The trapdoor was behind the locked door, which yielded to him in the way that Hogwarts tended to yield to him, not without effort, but with the quality of a place making a decision in his favor. He dropped through into the devil's snare, which was incapacitating if you fought it and irrelevant if you didn't. He relaxed and sank through it to the chamber below with the ease of a breath. He spent 3 hours in the chambers. The chess game was the most interesting, an entirely different magical signature than the others, older, built on game theory and pattern recognition rather than conventional spellwork. He played it through twice, losing the first time deliberately to understand how it adapted, winning the second time with an approach that treated the pieces as a system rather than individual assets. The pieces themselves were extraordinary. Old magic in them, the kind that developed in objects after centuries of consistent use and purpose. The potion puzzle at the end, Snape's contribution to the chamber's defenses, was elegant and cold and exactly Snape. Harry solved it in 6 minutes and committed the solution to memory. He came back out and wrote 3 pages of notes, and then he wrote Hermione a letter about the chess pieces because he had a theory about their magical development that intersected with something she'd noted in the resonance book's margins and he wanted to test it against her. The thing with Quirrell happened on December 22nd, which was 4 days earlier than Dumbledore's estimated timeline. Harry woke at 2 in the morning with the clarity of someone whose instincts had been making an argument that his sleeping mind had finally accepted. He lay in the dark dormitory for a moment, only Ron in his bed, breathing steadily, and felt the castle. Something in it was off. A disturbance, low frequency, like a misplaced note in a chord. He got up. Dressed without lighting a lamp, just the ambient glow through the frost-edged windows. He wrote a note, 3rd floor, going down. Wake Dumbledore and Snape. And left it on Ron's pillow because Ron was the heaviest sleeper he'd ever met and would definitely not wake for a low-frequency magical disturbance, but would wake for a note on his face in the morning and do exactly what was needed. Then he picked up his wand and went. The 3rd floor corridor was empty. The locked door stood open, which it shouldn't, which meant Quirrell had passed through it already, and the lock enchantments Dumbledore had refreshed last week had held for approximately not long enough. He went through. The devil's snare reached for him and he dropped through it before it could commit. The winged keys in the second chamber were agitated, circling fast, disturbed. Quirrell had come through here. The key pattern had been disrupted and not fully restored, which meant he hadn't expected the chamber or hadn't had time to be careful. Harry collected the right key on the second pass and went on. The chess chamber stopped him briefly because Quirrell had broken through it differently, not strategically, but with enough raw power to simply overwhelm the pieces. The White Queen was in 3 pieces. Several pawns were shattered entirely. The remaining pieces stood frozen in a post-violence tableau that made Harry's chest tighten for reasons he wouldn't have fully been able to explain, something about the destruction of something built for beauty and intelligence rather than force. He crossed through the wreckage quickly. The troll, Quirrell had dealt with it in the most direct way possible, by stunning it from the doorway before it registered his presence. It lay across the room like a felled tree. The fire chambers came next, and Harry drank the right potion without hesitation and passed through. The last chamber was lit with purple flame and held a single mirror. The mirror of Eriste. He'd wondered about it since he'd covered its face on the 6th floor in October. Now it stood here, at the center of the final chamber, and in front of it stood Quirrell with his back to Harry, very still, staring at the reflection with the frustrated intensity of a man who had been given the answer key to a test and still couldn't solve it. Harry stepped fully into the chamber. The purple flame closed behind him. The only sound was the fire and Quirrell's breathing and the soft, high pressure of the chamber's old magic. "I've been looking at it for 20 minutes, Quirrell said, without turning around. No stammer. Just the flat, clear voice Harry had heard once before at breakfast, 3 months ago. "It won't show me what I need." "It shows you what you want," Harry said. "There's a difference." Quirrell turned. His face was different in the firelight than in the classroom, stripped of the performance, showing just the architecture underneath. Intelligent, hollowed, the face of a man who had made a series of choices that had taken him somewhere he couldn't come back from. There was no particular malice in it. There was something worse, conviction. "The famous Harry Potter," he said. "The possessed defense teacher," Harry said. "How's that going?" Quirrell blinked. He had prepared for several responses and this apparently wasn't among them. "You're not afraid." "I know what you are. Being afraid of something you know is less useful than thinking about it." Harry looked at the mirror. What do you see? Myself presenting the stone to my master. Flat, factual. The mirror isn't showing it. Because you want to use it, Harry said. The mirror shows your heart's desire, but the stone's enchantment requires someone who wants to find the stone and not use it. He looked at Quirrell steadily. Dumbledore's clever that way. Then you look, Quirrell said. No. Something shifted in Quirrell's expression, the academic patience wearing thin. I'm not asking. I know. Harry held his wand loosely in his right hand, not raised, not pointed. I'm telling you that looking in the mirror won't help you. Even if I could get the stone out, I wouldn't hand it to you. And if I tried to keep it for myself, the enchantment wouldn't give it to me either. He tilted his head. You're at a dead end. Master, Quirrell said softly, in the tone of a man speaking to something that lived inside him. The turban began to unwind. Harry had anticipated this possibility, had read about wraith hosts, about the specific mechanics of a spirit maintaining existence by borrowing a body's physical resources, but anticipation is not the same as readiness, and what was on the back of Quirrell's head when the turban fell away was genuinely wrong in a way that bypassed the intellect and spoke directly to something older and more animal. The face on the back of Quirrell's skull was thin and white and not fully formed, like something that had been preserved past the point where preservation was kind. Red eyes, slitted. A mouth that moved. Harry Potter, it said, and the voice had the quality of cold water in a dark room. We meet. At last. Tom Riddle, Harry said. The red eyes moved. Something in them registered, and it was interesting, the face's reaction to its own name, spoken simply, without the performance of fear that was apparently standard. My name, Voldemort said, is not what matters here. Your name is exactly what matters, Harry said. You were Tom Riddle before you were anything else. A boy who went to Gringotts and tried to claim the Gaunt inheritance. He kept his voice level, conversational, not provocative but direct. Before the Horcruxes, before the followers, before all of it. Just a boy trying to claim power he was born near but didn't actually own. I made myself what I am, Voldemort said. You made yourself into this, Harry agreed, gesturing slightly toward the face on the back of Quirrell's skull. Wraith. Host-dependent. Chasing a stone in a school because you don't have a body and your current candidate is discovering that the mirror's enchantment doesn't want you. He kept the wand loose and his breathing even. I don't think this is what you intended. Spare me the psychology of a schoolboy. It's not psychology, Harry said. It's just observation. You're here. You're reduced. And the one person who could theoretically help you right now is going to refuse. He looked at the red eyes without flinching. The stone isn't leaving this chamber tonight. Voldemort's face did something that was probably meant to be a smile. You cannot stop me with a schoolboy's wand. Probably not in a direct contest, Harry agreed. You're significantly more powerful than I am, even like this. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He raised his wand. But you're also in a borrowed body in a chamber with one exit, and I've been down here for 3 hours this week alone learning it. And I'm not the only one who knows you're here. Your teachers, Voldemort said dismissively. Your broken headmaster with his broken magic. And Snape, Harry said. Who has been watching Quirrell for 3 months and knows the sound of that voice because he heard it for years. Who is currently, he checked the feeling of the castle, that low hum, coming through the chest chamber. He paused. He'll be here in about 2 minutes. 3 if he's being careful with the pieces. Something moved in the red eyes. Not fear. Recalculation. The stone, Voldemort said. Isn't here, Harry said. Not anymore. Silence. Dumbledore moved it this morning, Harry said. Or rather, Dumbledore asked Ragnarok to move it 3 days ago when our timeline suggested you'd move before Christmas. It was transferred back to Gringotts this morning under a new security protocol that I suggested and that Ragnarok improved significantly. He watched Voldemort's face. You're in an empty chamber. The fire in the room went cold. Not physically, the purple flames kept burning, but the emotional temperature of the space dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the heating charms. Voldemort went very quiet, which was more frightening than the theatrics would have been because the quiet had the quality of something vast and patient that had just shifted its full attention to a single point. Quirrell's hands raised. The curse came fast, wordless, the bright killing green that Harry had seen once in a memory he'd never asked to access, appearing in his own dreams since before he understood what it was. It came fast and he moved. Not a shield, the responsive variant wouldn't hold against something this concentrated. He threw himself sideways and the curse hit the mirror, which didn't break. The mirror absorbed it with a sound like a struck bell and went dark for a moment before clearing. Harry came up moving, wand already tracking. Incendio was a second-year charm by curriculum standards and a devastatingly practical tool by any actual standard, and Harry had spent October learning the responsive shield variant and November doing exactly what Flitwick had suggested and developing the underlying theory into 3 other applications. The fire that came from his wand was not a candle-lighting spell. It was hot and fast and it hit the purple fire in the chamber walls and the 2 fires recognized each other and merged and the whole chamber brightened by 3 orders of magnitude. Quirrell stumbled back from the heat. "Kill him," Voldemort said, but the problem with a host-parasite arrangement was that the host's physical limitations applied to both of them, and Quirrell was a man who had been hollowing himself out for months to sustain an unwanted passenger, and Quirrell was also currently in a room that was significantly brighter and hotter than it had been 30 seconds ago. Harry moved again, not back, forward, cutting the angle. He wasn't trying to overpower Quirrell. He was trying to outmaneuver him, which was a different problem with a different solution, and the solution involved keeping him unable to get a clean line for a second curse while the fire he'd amplified continued to do its specific work on the temperature and light conditions. Quirrell's second curse went wide. His third tracked better and Harry ducked under it and came up inside Quirrell's guard, close, too close for curse work, and put his hand flat against the side of Quirrell's face. Contact. The reaction was immediate and violent and entirely unplanned. His mother's protection was apparently real and apparently specific and apparently did not enjoy being in proximity to the thing that had triggered it, because what came from Harry's hand was not magic he'd cast deliberately, it was something deeper, something the books hadn't fully explained, the protective enchantment his mother had woven into his survival by dying for him, reacting to the presence of her murderer like an immune response to a known pathogen. Quirrell screamed. Not because Harry was hurting him exactly, Voldemort was burning where Harry's skin made contact, the borrowed host reacting to a presence that was specifically and permanently unwelcome. Voldemort tried to pull back through Quirrell, away from the contact, but Harry kept his hand where it was, not out of cruelty, but because moving meant Quirrell could cast again and Voldemort could regroup and the 30 seconds of advantage he had right now was a finite resource. The door of the chamber opened behind him. He heard Snape's footsteps, fast and purposeful, and then a wordless spell hit Quirrell's wand hand and disarmed him cleanly. Harry stepped back, breathing, and the fire in the walls burned on. Snape stood in the chamber entrance looking at Quirrell on the ground and Harry standing over him with a face that was cycling through several kinds of controlled intensity. Then he looked at Harry specifically, at his outstretched hand, at the faint shimmer on his skin that was already fading, and said, very precisely, "The stone." "Gringotts," Harry said. 3 days ago. Snape looked at Quirrell. Then at the dark mirror. Then at Harry. "Explain," he said. Voldemort needed a body. The stone was his method. Dumbledore and I moved it when we calculated his timeline was earlier than planned. Harry flexed his hand. The shimmer was gone. The mirror's still here because moving it was impractical and it's enchanted against destruction anyway. Quirrell got through the 7 chambers. He got to the mirror and couldn't extract the stone because the enchantment required someone who wanted to find it and not use it. He paused. And then I came down and told him the stone was already gone. Snape was looking at him with the expression Harry had been gradually learning to read over 4 months. It cycled through, professional assessment, reluctant surprise, something more personal that Snape kept behind glass, and then back to professional because that was the most comfortable register. You came down alone, Snape said. Ron has a note, Harry said. He'll wake up and get Dumbledore. You came down alone, Snape repeated, and this time there was something in it, not accusation, a kind of appalled recognition, like looking at an action that was absolutely something he himself would have done at 11. I left a note, Harry said again. Quirrell was unconscious. On the back of his head, Voldemort's face was, wrong, darker, the red eyes closed. Whatever the contact had done, the wraith was diminished. Not destroyed, Harry had no illusions about that, nothing this old and this persistent ended in a school basement, but reduced. He'll need to leave the host, Harry said. This body's damaged by the contact. He'll have to find another method or another host. He looked at Voldemort's still face. Which means we have time. Not a lot of it, but more than we had 20 minutes ago. Snape looked at Quirrell for a long moment. Then, without any visible change in his expression, he cast a containment charm that was extraordinarily complex, third-year undergraduate ward work at minimum, and said, Dumbledore needs to be here. Yes, Harry said. And I, Snape said, need a moment to resist the fairly significant impulse to shout at you for coming down here alone. I'd rather you didn't, Harry said. I know. He turned. Come. We'll meet Dumbledore at the trapdoor. Harry moved to follow, and as he passed the mirror of Eriste he looked at it directly for the first time since he'd uncovered it in October. The chamber's amplified firelight made it burn like bronze. He didn't stop, didn't pause, just looked as he passed. His parents looked back, warm and complete and present in a way that made his chest ache cleanly. He kept walking. Dumbledore arrived at the trapdoor entrance to find Harry and Snape emerging from it simultaneously, Quirrell suspended between two containment spells and a series of binding charms that Snape had applied with the efficiency of someone who had been carrying around very specific magical responses to specific bad scenarios and was finally getting to use them. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. The stone is safe, Harry said. Quirrell got through all 7 chambers. The mirror stopped him because the enchantment worked exactly as you designed it, he couldn't extract the stone because he intended to use it. I confronted him, kept him in the chamber until Snape arrived, and the physical contact disrupted Voldemort's hold on the host. He said it clearly and in sequence, the way you briefed someone who needed information quickly. Voldemort is diminished but not gone. He'll need time to find another method. We probably have months, maybe longer. Dumbledore's eyes moved from Harry to Snape to the unconscious Quirrell to Harry again. Are you hurt? He asked. No. Your hand, the protection. It activated on contact. It's fine. He looked at Dumbledore. Your enchantment for the stone's extraction was the right call. If it had been extractable, this would have gone differently. You told me, Dumbledore said, 3 weeks ago, that the protection logic was sound but that the enchantment's success depended entirely on who stood in front of the mirror. He paused. I didn't expect you to be the one standing there. I know, Harry said. That's why it worked. Snape made a very quiet sound that was not quite a laugh. Severus, Dumbledore said. He's right, Snape said. Annoyingly. Dumbledore looked at Harry with the expression Harry was beginning to recognize as the one Dumbledore wore when he was not managing himself for an audience, when he was just a very old man trying to understand something he'd gotten badly wrong and figure out how to be better. You planned this, he said. The early transfer of the stone. The chamber preparation. You planned it without telling me the full picture. I told you we needed to move the stone early, Harry said. I asked Ragnarok independently because the Gringotts transfer required account holder authorization that you don't have for my accounts. I didn't tell you the exact timing because, he stopped. Because? Dumbledore said. Because you would have wanted to manage it, Harry said, not unkindly. You would have had a plan and the plan would have had a role for me and the role would have been more limited than what I actually needed to do. I've been inside those chambers. I know them better than anyone in this school right now. Putting me in a backup position while someone else ran point would have been the wrong call. Dumbledore was quiet. In the torchlight of the third-floor corridor he looked old and thin and entirely without his usual aura of orchestrated wisdom. Just a person, standing in the aftermath. "You're right," he said. Again. "I know it's uncomfortable," Harry said. "Harry," Dumbledore said, and his voice was very quiet. "I want to ask you something and I want you to know that I'm asking, not directing. Not arranging. Okay. The prophecy. You know its general shape, that you and Voldemort are bound, that one must eliminate the other. Knowing that," he paused. "Are you afraid?" Harry thought about it honestly. He stood in the cold third-floor corridor at 3 a.m. with the smell of the fire chambers still on his robes and Quirrell suspended a few feet away, and he thought about a wraith on the back of a skull and red eyes going still under his hand and the ancient burning weight of a dead woman's love in his palm. "Not of him," Harry said. "Not specifically. I'm aware of what it means. I don't like it." He looked at Dumbledore. "But being afraid of it doesn't change it. What changes it is understanding it and preparing for it and dealing with it when it comes." He shrugged, slightly. "Tonight was a piece of that. And you'll let me help?" Dumbledore asked. "With what comes next? Knowing what I did. Will you let me help?" Harry looked at him for a moment. "If you're honest with me," he said. "Full information, both ways. Not the managed version." He paused. "Not because I need you. Because two people working with complete information are better than one person working with half a picture." He tilted his head. "Can you do that?" "I don't know," Dumbledore said, with more honesty than Harry had heard from him yet. "I have a very old habit of deciding what other people need to know. I'm not certain I can change it entirely. But he stopped. "I will try. Genuinely. You have my word." Harry nodded once. "Good," he said. "Now someone should probably deal with Quirrell before morning." The aftermath was quiet. Quirrell was taken to St. Mungo's under a Snape-authored cover story about a catastrophic reaction to a potions experiment that nobody outside the relevant parties would question. The containment kept what remained of Voldemort's presence dormant. The healer's report, 3 days later, indicated that the host damage was too severe, Quirrell wouldn't survive the month, and the wraith had already separated, dispersed to wherever wraiths disperse to when their immediate vehicle failed them. Gone. For now. Dumbledore told McGonagall the truth, all of it, in a 2-hour conversation that Harry wasn't in the room for but whose aftermath he could read clearly in the way McGonagall looked at Dumbledore for the following week, the expression of a woman recalibrating something significant and not yet done with the recalibration. Snape received no official recognition for his role, which was his explicit preference, stated in the flat, non-negotiable manner of someone who had thought about it for 0 seconds before answering. He did receive, the morning after, a note from Harry that said, "You were 2 minutes fast. I was glad for it. H." And Snape had, alone in his office, read it twice and set it face down on the desk and not responded, which was Snape's version of accepting a compliment with grace. The stone was in Gringotts and Ragnarok had assured Harry that it would remain there until Flamel was consulted about its disposal, which Flamel had apparently been willing to consider for some time and which Dumbledore, without the stone to protect, had finally been willing to discuss. Harry spent the remaining days of the Christmas holiday reading. He finished Hermione's resonance book, wrote her 11 pages of responses including 3 full theoretical extensions of the principles she'd marked, and received back 8 pages plus a very short addendum that just said, "The third extension is wrong but interestingly wrong. Explain your reasoning for step 4. I think there's something there." He spent 2 pleasant hours working out why he was wrong and what it implied and wrote back. Ron challenged him to chess every morning and won 6 times out of 7, and the one time Harry won, Ron said, "How did you?" and Harry showed him, and they spent the rest of that morning working through the logic of it together. On Christmas morning, Harry woke to a small pile of presents at the foot of his bed, which was new. From Hermione, a book on advanced magical theory, 4th edition, and a card that said I thought you'd have read the 3rd edition already. If you haven't, read that one first. Happy Christmas. From Ron, a box of every flavor beans and the note don't eat the gray ones, I speak from experience. From Ragnarok, which was unexpected and distinctive, a small flat package that contained a single folded piece of parchment, old, covered in dense goblin script, and a note that read, a record of the first Goblin Wizard Compact, 967 CE. You said you wanted to understand how things worked. This is where much of it started. Happy Christmas, Mr. Potter, from those of us watching with interest. R. From Neville, a small pot of Mimbulus Mimbletonia seedling with a note that said Gran says hello. She also says to tell you that the Wisengamot vote on the estate management investigation has been scheduled for March. She says to be ready, whatever that means. From Dumbledore, nothing wrapped, just an envelope, and inside the envelope was a piece of parchment on which was written the full text of the prophecy. Not a summary. Not a managed version. The full text, exactly as it had been given. Harry read it in the early Christmas morning with the cold light coming through the frosted window and the castle warm and quiet around him. He read it twice. Then he folded it, put it in the box with the other things worth keeping, and went down to breakfast. The great hall had a tree and enchanted snow, and Fred and George were already engaged in some kind of battle with a dung bomb that had gotten out of hand, and Ron was at the table with a plate piled embarrassingly high and a grin that was the most uncomplicated thing in Harry's world. Harry sat down and poured himself pumpkin juice. Happy Christmas, Ron said. Happy Christmas, Harry said. He ate his breakfast in the warm, snowy hall, and the prophecy sat in its folded parchment in the box upstairs, and the castle hummed its deep patient hum, and Harry didn't think about what came next for exactly 20 minutes, which was, he had decided, an acceptable allowance. Then he thought about it, because it was coming, and he preferred to meet things moving toward them rather than waiting for them to arrive. Augusta Longbottom's letter arrived the day after Christmas, and it was 3 pages long and written in her decisive, unornamented hand, and the final paragraph read, "The Ministry investigation has broader support than I initially anticipated. 3 Wisengamot members I expected to oppose have indicated willingness to review the evidence. Whatever Dumbledore managed or mismanaged, the documentation from Gringotts is substantial and the institutional implications go beyond one man's decisions. I expect this will be messy. Messy things in the Wisengamot often become important things. Be ready to speak, if asked. What you say and how you say it will matter more than you currently know. Neville tells me you are becoming someone worth knowing. I have decided he is correct. This is rare praise from me. I trust you will use it well." Augusta Longbottom. Harry read it and then read it again, specifically the part about Neville. He put the letter in the box. Then he pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and wrote back to Augusta about 3 specific Wisengamot procedural mechanisms that he'd found in the magical law text and that applied to the investigation in ways he thought she might not have considered yet. Her response arrived the same evening. It was very short. "Where on earth did you find Thistlewick's procedural compendium? That edition has been out of print since 1963. More importantly, you're right about section 14. I'll draft the motion tonight. Continue being useful, Mr. Potter." Harry smiled at that. He wrote one more letter before bed, to Ragnarok, about the Goblin Compact document, and about a question that had been forming in the back of his mind since he'd read it, whether there was a precedent for a formal revised compact between a wizard account holder and Gringotts that went beyond the standard account relationship. The question was preliminary. He wasn't ready to frame it completely. But the shape of it was there, and it seemed like the right direction, and he'd learned this year that directions mattered at least as much as destinations. He sealed the letter and tied it to Athena's leg, and she regarded him with those serious amber eyes, and he scratched her feathers once and opened the window and let the cold Christmas night in for a moment while she launched herself into the dark. Then he closed the window and went to sleep. Chapter 6, What he built instead. January came in cold and bright, the kind of Scottish winter that felt like an opinion rather than a season. The students returned from holiday in stages, the Hogwarts Express pulling in on the second, students filing through the entrance hall with their trunks and their accumulated fortnight of home, the castle filling back up with noise and movement until it felt like itself again. Harry was at the top of the entrance hall steps when Hermione came through the doors, and she had her book bag in her trunk and an expression that said she'd spent half the holiday reading and the other half thinking about what she'd read, which was the Hermione version of A Perfect Christmas. She stopped when she saw him. "The third extension," she said, by way of greeting. "Step 4 needs a modification to the resonance coefficient," Harry said. "I worked it out last night. I'll show you after dinner." She dropped her bag on the steps and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. "I worked it out on the train. I think we arrived at the same place by different routes." They compared notes in the entrance hall for 4 minutes while students flowed around them with the comfortable chaos of a river around two rocks, and Harry watched Hermione's face as she found the point where their workings converged and made the same small satisfied sound she made when something confirmed itself. "Same conclusion," she said. "From different directions," Harry agreed. "That's how you know it's right." Ron appeared behind Hermione with his trunk, took in the scene of mathematical parchment and mutual focus, and said, "Did you two spend the entire holiday writing letters about maths?" "Magic theory," Hermione said. "Happy New Year to you as well, Ron," Harry said. Ron dropped his trunk beside Hermione's with a thud. "I got one letter," he said, to Harry. "One. It had 11 pages of something with fractions in it." "There are no fractions in magical resonance theory," Hermione said. "There were fractions in mine," Ron said, pointing at Harry. "Those were ratios." "Ratios," Ron repeated, in the tone of a man betrayed. Then he grinned. "It was a good Christmas. Mum sent the usual food. Bill wrote from Egypt about a curse he'd broken and Dad took the fireplace apart to see how the flow network connected and then couldn't get it back together until New Year's Eve." He paused. "We used the back door for 5 days. Percy wrote a strongly worded letter about household maintenance standards and nobody told him about the fireplace." "How is your family?" Harry asked. Ron looked at him. There was something in the question, the simple, genuine interest of it, that Ron seemed to register as different from small talk. "Good," he said, and then more honestly, loud. "Good and loud. Mum worries about everything simultaneously and Dad's enthusiastic about everything Muggle and the twins were banned from the kitchen after October and Ginny wants to come to Hogwarts so badly it's almost painful to watch." He picked up his trunk. "It's a good kind of loud, mostly." Harry helped him with the trunk up the stairs, because that was the kind of thing you did, and Hermione took one end without being asked, and they got it up 2 flights in comfortable argument about whether the optimal method was magical levitation or physical effort, which Ron settled by pointing out that he had 6 brothers and had been carrying trunks without magic since he was 4. Neville was already in the common room, back the night before, and he'd rearranged his corner of the dormitory to include a new shelf, several new plants on it, various sizes, all looked at with the particular attention he gave living things that he gave nothing else. He'd brought seeds back from home that Augusta had apparently pressed on him with the accompanying note that plant magic was undervalued by the current curriculum. He looked up when Harry came in. "You saw my Grand's letter. I wrote back to her 3 times. Neville looked at him. "She wrote back 4 times. "She wrote to you 4 times, Neville said, as if checking the arithmetic on something improbable. "In the holiday. We were working through the Wisengamot procedural question." Harry set his bag down. "She's sharp, Neville. Genuinely sharp. She sees the political geometry faster than anyone I've read." Neville was quiet for a moment, and Harry recognized the quality of it, not hurt, something more complicated, the mix of pride and old sadness that came from hearing someone describe a person you loved in terms that were true but that you'd never quite heard applied to your own relationship with them. Augusta Longbottom loved her grandson absolutely and had spent 11 years shaping him rather than knowing him, and the distance between those two things was something Neville carried carefully. "She told me," Neville said, "that she thinks I've been good for you." "She told me she thinks you've become someone worth knowing," Harry said. "Which I could have told her in August." Neville looked at his plants. "She doesn't," he stopped. Started again. "She's not good at saying things simply. The way you just said that. She says things in ways that are wrapped up in expectation. Like even a compliment comes with what you're supposed to do with it." He touched one of the seedlings. "I know she loves me. I've always known. Sometimes I want her to just say it without the rest of it." "Have you told her that?" A pause. "No," Neville said. "Obviously not." "You should," Harry said. Neville looked at him. "She'll respect it," Harry said. "She respects directness. That's the version of her that showed up for that meeting. She wasn't wrapped in implication, she just said exactly what she thought and expected the same back." He sat on the edge of his own bed. "I think she'd be relieved if you told her. I think she probably knows and doesn't know how to cross to the other side of it herself." Neville was quiet for a long moment, his hand still on the seedling. "Maybe," he said. "Not this week," Harry said. "But think about it." Term resumed with the energy of a new year, which was different from the energy of a new term, less self-conscious, more purposeful, as if the holiday had cleared some space and everyone had come back with slightly better ideas of what they were doing. Even the classes felt sharper. McGonagall set a transfiguration assignment that was genuinely complex, a 3-stage transformation requiring sequential object identity changes, and the class dug into it with the focused effort of people who had spent 2 weeks resting their brains and were ready to use them again. Harry finished the first 2 stages in the double period and spent the third working on the third stage by following the same principle he'd applied to the match and needle in September, understanding both states before attempting the transition. The first 2 had been clear. The third required him to transform something that had already been transformed, which was a fundamentally different problem. You were negotiating with an object that had already had one identity replaced and was, in magical terms, still integrating the change. He sat with it for 20 minutes and didn't solve it, which was informative. The limits were useful. He made notes about why it wasn't working and handed in what he had. McGonagall kept him after. "You stopped," she said. "The third stage needs a different approach. The object's been transformed once already, its magical signature is still reconciling the first change. Trying to impose a second transformation before the first has settled is like writing on wet ink." He paused. "I could have forced it. I think it would have been technically successful but fundamentally unstable." McGonagall regarded him from behind her desk with the expression she'd been wearing since September, the one that was consistently reassessing something. "Most students force it and note the instability as an acceptable result. Most students are being assessed on whether it works," Harry said. "I'm more interested in why it doesn't." "The instability would have been accepted for full marks," she said. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "But I'd have known I'd forced it. That's not useful to me." A pause. "The second transformation is theoretically possible with the object in its transitional state," McGonagall said. "No text at the Hogwarts level addresses how to do it because it isn't expected of students until 6th year. If you find the method before next class, I'll give you the credit. If you don't," she opened her desk drawer and set a thin book on the desk. "This might give you a direction." He took the book. Flipped to the marked page. Read the first 2 paragraphs and understood immediately why she'd marked it. "Thank you, Professor." "Don't thank me," she said. "Come back with the answer." She paused. "And Mr. Potter? What happened over the Christmas holiday? With the chambers?" She said it carefully, in the manner of someone who had spent 2 weeks deciding how to approach a subject. "You conducted yourself well. Snape arrived in time," Harry said. "It wasn't solo. He was behind you by enough margin that it was functionally solo for the critical period. She looked at him with the assessment he'd come to understand as her version of genuine regard, not soft, not distant, just clear and honest and direct. You were prepared. More prepared than anyone had the right to expect from a first-year student. She paused. That preparation was your own work. I'm noting it. Professor, Harry said. Can I ask you something? You may. The Wisengamot investigation. The estate management filing. It's going to come to a formal session in March. Augusta Longbottom has told me I may be asked to give a statement. He looked at her. What's your position on it? Not officially, personally. McGonagall was quiet for several seconds. Outside her window, the grounds were white and the loch was steel-grey under cloud. Personally, she said, I believe that institutions must account for their actions. That good intentions do not absolve institutional misconduct. And that the most important thing a school can teach a student is not magic, but that they have the right to make their own choices about their own lives. She looked at him. I also believe that Albus Dumbledore is a genuinely great man who made a serious mistake in his treatment of you, and that both of those things can be true simultaneously. I know they can, Harry said. That's why I'm not trying to burn him down. She looked at him steadily. What are you trying to do? Make sure it doesn't happen again, Harry said. To anyone. McGonagall held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the same finality as Ragnarok's nod in September, a gesture that wasn't common and meant something specific when it appeared. Take the book, she said. Come back Thursday. February was Ragnarok's letter and the Wisengamot motion's formal filing and Draco Malfoy choosing a different lunch seat than usual and sitting near Harry for the first time without his usual social backdrop. Harry was eating and reading simultaneously, which he'd refined to a specific system over the year, and he registered Draco sitting across from him with the awareness he kept for peripheral movements but didn't look up until he'd finished his paragraph. Your father, he said, which was a greeting they'd apparently established as their default. Furious, Draco said. About the estate investigation. He's been in meetings since January. He poured himself pumpkin juice with the automatic, precise manner of a boy raised at formal tables. He knows the investigation has more support than he planned for. He's recalibrating. What does recalibrating look like for Lucius Malfoy? Contingencies, Draco said. He builds them. Always has more than one position. He's not someone who gets caught without an exit. He looked at his plate. He's also been in contact with people I don't know the names of. Meetings at the manor that I'm not part of. Harry set down his fork. Are you all right? Draco looked up. The question clearly caught him. What? You're describing your father's political maneuvers, Harry said. I'm asking if you're all right. Those are different topics. A pause. The great hall moved around them with its usual Friday lunchtime energy, conversation, laughter, the Weasley twins apparently conducting a transaction with a Hufflepuff third year that involved a small paper package and a handshake. I don't know, Draco said, with more honesty than Harry had heard from him. He looked at his plate, not Harry. He's my father. I know what he is and I know what he's done, the old wars, the Death Eater trials, what he claimed afterward. I'm not stupid. A pause. I've known for a while. That the story I was told about the war, about our family's position, it has gaps in it. He picked up his pumpkin juice. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. Nothing yet, Harry said. You just know it. Knowing something real is better than a comfortable lie even when the real thing is complicated. He looked at Draco. You've been giving me information. You don't owe me that. You keep choosing to. Yes, Draco said. Why? The question hung for a moment. Because you're not what I was told, Draco said. And if the thing I was told about you is wrong, then other things I was told might also be wrong, and, he stopped. And that's uncomfortable. But it's important. He said important like someone who had just recently found the word and wasn't yet entirely comfortable with what it required of him. It is, Harry agreed. They ate in silence for a moment, which was not an awkward silence. Just two people at the same table, on the same side of something neither of them had fully named yet. The Slytherin Lordship Challenge, Draco said eventually. My father's going to win it. I know. Does that bother you? No, Harry said. I told you in August, it's in play, whoever's willing to fight for it. That's not my concern. He looked at Draco. What it does is give your father a Wizengamot seat he'll use in specific ways that I need to understand. So I'm watching the process, not trying to interfere with it. Draco looked at him. You're not going to contest it. I never planned to. My father assumed you would eventually. That the refusal was strategic. Positioning. He shook his head slightly. He doesn't believe someone would genuinely not want it. I genuinely don't want it, Harry said. I want to learn. I want to understand the whole board. I want to build something that belongs to me. He glanced at Draco. I have no interest in fighting for dead men's titles. Draco absorbed this for a long moment. If he asks me about this conversation, he said carefully, I won't tell him. I know, Harry said. It's not nothing. For me. That's a choice I'm making. I know that too, Harry said. He looked at Draco directly. I see it. Draco didn't respond verbally. But something in him settled, slightly, the way things settle when they've been acknowledged honestly for the first time. The Wizengamot session was March the 7th. Harry was called to testify by Ministry Owl in February, formal and burgundy sealed, requesting his presence on the 7th to provide a statement regarding events documented in Gringotts account records relating to the management of the Potter estate. He wrote back confirming his attendance, and then spent 3 weeks reading every procedural document Augusta had sent and several she hadn't, preparing not a dramatic speech but simply the facts in the order they'd occurred, clear and sequential and unembellished, because facts laid plainly were more powerful than argument. Dumbledore came to find him the week before. They walked on the grounds in the February grey, which had become their version of a meeting format. The office felt too enclosed for conversations between people still relearning their relationship, and the open air had a useful honesty to it. I'll be there, Dumbledore said. At the session. I know. I intend to confirm everything, he said. The bindings. The living arrangements. My role as executor. He walked with his hands behind his back, his breath clouding in the cold. I want you to know that before you go in. You don't need my permission for that, Harry said. No. But I wanted you to hear it from me. He paused. Harry. Whatever the Wizengamot decides, about me, about institutional accountability, I want you to know that I am not offering that confirmation for any strategic purpose. I'm not positioning myself for a sympathetic outcome. He stopped. I'm telling the truth because it's owed. That's all. Harry walked beside him and thought about that for a moment. What are you going to do? Harry asked. Afterward. Whatever the outcome. Dumbledore was quiet for a few paces. I find I don't know, he said. A century of knowing what to do and I find I don't know. He looked at the lake, the mountains, the castle above them. My magic continues to return. Slowly. I can cast perhaps 70% of what I could before. My instinct is to rebuild the structures I had. The coalitions, the oversight, the careful management of, he stopped. But that instinct is the thing that created this situation. So I'm questioning it. Good, Harry said. Keep questioning it. What would you have me do instead? Harry thought about it genuinely rather than rhetorically. Teach, he said. Not manage. Actually teach. You know more about magic than anyone alive. Pass it on without an agenda attached to it. He glanced up at Dumbledore. And let other people handle the politics. Augusta's already moving. The system is correcting itself. It doesn't need you to manage it, it needs you to stop. Dumbledore looked at him with an expression that was complicated and ancient and, underneath both, genuinely moved. That's both the hardest thing you've said to me and the most correct, he said. I know, Harry said. But you can do it. Why do you believe that? Because you admitted you were wrong, Harry said. Loudly wrong, in front of your staff and the ministry and a goblin elder. Most people can't do that. The ones who can are usually capable of the next step too. They walked back toward the castle in the cold, and the lock was dark and still beside them, and Dumbledore didn't say anything else for a while, but the quality of his silence had changed. The Wisengamot session was a stone chamber and tiered seats and the formal gravity of a room that had been making decisions about wizarding Britain for several hundred years. Harry sat in the witness chair with his hands in his lap and answered every question he was asked directly and completely. He described the binding removal at Gringotts. He described the 3 compulsions, the magical suppression, the deference inclination, the monitoring charm, and whose signatures were on each. He described 11 years at Privet Drive without any particular drama, just the facts of it, the cupboard, the food allocation, the address on his Hogwarts letter. He described the Gringotts Compact and its dissolution as a consequence of his refusal rather than an action he'd planned, because that was what had happened and accuracy mattered. He was calm the entire time. Not performing calm. Actually calm, in the way that came from having decided before walking in the room that the truth was sufficient and that delivering it clearly was the only thing required of him. Augusta had told him in her briefing, say what happened. Do not editorialize. Do not apologize. Do not soften. You are not making an argument. You are stating facts and allowing the facts to argue for themselves. She had been, as usual, correct. When he was done, the chamber was quiet in the way of rooms that have just processed something significant. Dumbledore testified after. He confirmed everything Harry had said and added 3 things Harry hadn't known: the original documentation of the binding's placement, the legal authorization he'd used as executor, and a formal written acknowledgement of responsibility that he'd prepared with his solicitor and submitted to the chamber clerk before the session began. It was, Harry thought, watching from the gallery where he'd moved after testifying, a genuine act. Not managed. Not positioned for sympathy. An old man in a stone room telling the truth to 100 people about what he'd done wrong, and not mitigating it. The chamber voted 5-1 in favor of formal censure, the strongest institutional rebuke short of criminal proceedings, and a required review of all estate executor appointments held by Albus Dumbledore. There were also 3 procedural motions that Augusta had drafted using the mechanisms Harry had found in Thistlewick's compendium, establishing new oversight requirements for guardian appointments of minor magical heirs. As they left the chamber, Augusta fell into step beside Harry. Well done, she said. I just answered questions. You answered them correctly, without sentiment, under the scrutiny of 100 powerful people, and you made it look like breathing. She looked at him sidelong. That is not nothing. He almost smiled. You coached me well. I gave you the framework, she said. The delivery was your own. She paused. Neville was watching from the visitors' gallery. Harry glanced up and found Neville near the back of the departing crowd, meeting his eyes briefly with a look that was proud, Harry thought. Just quietly, genuinely proud. Not of the outcome. Of the fact of it. Of Harry having stood in a room and said what was true and let it be enough. Harry nodded at him and Neville nodded back, and it was a brief exchange that contained something larger than brief exchanges usually held. April came in warm. The grounds greened. Harry's magic had been doing something new since the chamber confrontation in December, something incremental that he'd been noticing and not yet fully naming. His responsive shield variant had become functionally automatic, not deliberate casting but a reflex, the way you flinch from impact without deciding to. In Charms, Flitwick had pointed this out with the particular delight of a professor watching a student internalize something at a cellular level. "You're not casting," Flitwick had said, "you're responding. That's the highest level of Charms integration. 7th year standard. Don't tell anyone in the upper forms." It wasn't just Charms. In Transfiguration he'd solved the sequential transformation problem, the third stage, the transitional object, by a method that McGonagall confirmed was not in the third-year text he should have been using but was, she said, adjacent to a principle addressed in NEWT preparation, which you appear to have arrived at independently. She'd given him the credit and set the follow-on problem the same afternoon. In the castle at night, sometimes, he felt Hogwarts the way he'd felt it since September but more clearly now, not the castle being aware of him, but a mutual awareness, a reciprocal attention between a person and a place that had deep magic in its stones and that seemed, in whatever way old magical places could seem things, to consider him a resident rather than a guest. He mentioned this to Hermione. "The castle has sentience," she said immediately, the way she said everything she was about to read extensively about. "Not sentience. Recognition." He thought about how to put it. "Like, it knows where I am. It doesn't mind. That's documented in Hogwarts, a history," she said. "The castle's original enchantment included a residential awareness, it tracks the people who belong to it. Usually headmasters, long-standing staff." She paused. "It's not supposed to extend to students." "Maybe it extended," Harry said. Hermione looked at him. "Or maybe you're the first student it's ever considered worth tracking." He sat with that for a moment. "The founders built the castle to teach," he said slowly. "Deep in the magic of it. That's its purpose, not housing, teaching. Finding someone who actually wants to learn everything it has to offer, it's responding to you," Hermione said, and her voice had the quality it got when a theory arrived fully formed and she was checking it against available evidence. "Not because of your family or your power. Because of how you engage with it." She looked toward the stone wall beside them as if seeing through it. "You walked into Gringotts and refused a collection of inherited things. You walked into Hogwarts and treated it like a library you actually wanted to read. And the castle knows that. Old magic knows intent," she said. "That's in every foundational text. Intent shapes magical response more than any other variable." She looked at him. "Harry. Do you understand what that means for you long-term? If Hogwarts is, aligned with you, the way old magical compacts work, not yet," he said. "I don't want to understand it wrong by rushing it." She nodded, the frustrated but respectful nod of someone who agreed with the principle but found patience difficult. "I'll write it up," she said. "The theoretical framework. When you're ready." "I know you will," he said. "And it'll be better than anything I'd write myself because you'll catch what I'm missing." She looked momentarily startled, in the way she still occasionally looked startled when someone valued what she contributed. "Yes," she said, more quietly than usual. "I will." The end-of-year exams arrived in May like a scheduled event everyone had known was coming but still felt slightly hurried by. Harry prepared in the usual way, systematically, starting 3 weeks early, building a revision structure that covered the gaps rather than reinforcing the already solid areas, which Hermione said was the correct approach and that most students did backwards. He topped every subject. Not by a small margin in most of them. Flitwick was visibly pleased in a way he was trying to temper for professional balance. McGonagall marked his Transfiguration practical with a comment that said outstanding, work substantially above first-year standard across all assessed components. Snape's written comment on his potions final was a single word, acceptable. Harry understood that from Snape, this meant something closer to exceptional, and he was quietly satisfied. Defense against the dark arts was taught by a rotating series of staff following Quirrell's absence, which had been attributed to the potion's accident cover story. Harry scored highest in the practical regardless, which seemed to produce mixed feelings in the staff marking it, given that none of them had taught him anything he demonstrated. The last day of term arrived as last days of term did, with the feeling of a breath about to be released. The great hall for the final feast was warm and loud, and the interhouse point ceremony produced Gryffindor's winning total, and Fred and George responded to this with the calibrated enthusiasm of people who had been engineering exactly this outcome for several months. Harry ate his feast and looked around the table, Ron beside him, already planning the summer in terms of chess games and Quidditch and whether he could talk his mother into the degenoming of the garden as a group activity. Hermione across from him, reading with one hand and eating with the other, pausing occasionally to say something sharply relevant to a passing conversation. Neville at the far end, talking with a second-year herbology enthusiast he'd befriended in March, the conversation animated and specific in the way of people who had found their actual subject. He'd built this, Harry thought. Not arranged or inherited. Built from choices, the choice to refuse, to read, to pay attention, to say what was true and mean what he said and not perform whatever the room seemed to want. The choice to approach people as themselves rather than as functions. 3 people who had been waiting to be known and had found that he was interested in knowing them. A goblin elder who had watched something unprecedented and decided to keep watching. A grandmother who wrote political briefings to 11-year-olds and found them satisfactory correspondence. A headmaster learning to be honest instead of strategic. A potions master who said acceptable like a gift. A castle that tracked him through its stones. And underneath all of it, the thing he hadn't fully processed yet but had folded and put in a box because it needed time, the prophecy, the red eyes in a borrowed skull, the burning in his palm. The knowledge that this wasn't finished. That there was a road ahead that had a specific and significant difficulty at some point on it. He wasn't afraid of it. Not because it wasn't frightening. Because fear, he'd decided, was the wrong response. Fear made you reactive. What the road ahead needed was something else, preparation, yes, and intelligence, yes, and people he trusted. But more than any of those, it needed the thing he'd been building all year without entirely knowing he was building it. Himself. Not the instrument Dumbledore had tried to shape. Not the heir to 22 lordships. Not the boy who lived in the way the wizarding world had written that story, passive, fated, waiting for destiny to direct him. Just Harry. Who had walked into a goblin vault at 11 and said no to everything on offer and meant it completely. Who had taken his own small vault and his own unprescribed reading list and his own set of choices and built something from them. Dumbledore found him on the steps outside after the feast, in the warm June evening with the grounds going golden below. He sat beside Harry without preamble, which was its own kind of change, the old management of entrances and atmospheres absent, just an old man sitting next to a boy on some stone steps. Another year, Dumbledore said. Better than expected, Harry said. Considerably. He looked at the grounds. His magic was back at roughly 80% now, enough for everything functional, not enough for everything he'd had before. He seemed to have made a decision about that, though, that Harry recognized as a good decision. He wasn't treating the remainder as a loss to recover from but as a new parameter to work within. Harry. Yes. I've been thinking about what you said. In February. About teaching without agenda. He paused. I've decided to run a seminar next year. Advanced Magical Theory. Open to any year. No curriculum requirements, no formal assessment. Just, he paused, learning. Harry looked at him. Hermione will be there every session, Harry said. I assumed. And Neville, for the practical applications. Also assumed. And Ron for the chess-related magical strategy components, which I'm adding to the agenda. Dumbledore looked at him. I haven't announced the content yet. I know, Harry said. I'm adding those components. A pause. Then Dumbledore did something Harry had rarely seen from him, he laughed. A real laugh, not the managed chuckle but something that came from genuine, unorchestrated amusement, from a man who had been so serious for so long that laughter had become a surprise. All right, Dumbledore said, when it had passed. Yes. Those components. He looked at Harry with the honest eyes. I owe you, Harry. Beyond the apology and the Wisengamot and everything documented. I owe you years of, just being present. Without an agenda. He paused. I can't return those years. No, Harry agreed. But I'd like to, if you're willing, to try to be useful to you in the ones that remain. Without the management. Just. He paused again, and for a moment Harry saw through the century of him to something much younger and much more uncertain, a person who had once been a boy and had made choices that he'd been brilliant enough to justify to himself for decades. Just as myself. Harry looked at him. I know, Harry said. That's what I'd want. They sat on the steps in the June evening for a while, not speaking, while the students below moved on the grounds and the light went long and warm across the lawns. The train home the next day was full and loud, and Hermione had a book open before they'd cleared the platform, which was right and correct. Ron was setting up the chess board with the focused economy of someone who had been waiting for this specific rematch for 2 weeks. Neville had a letter he was reading from Augusta. He looked up from it twice with expressions that moved from surprise to something warm, and Harry caught his eye once and Neville held up the letter slightly, which was enough. Harry sat with his back against the window and looked at his friends, and then at the landscape opening up beyond the glass as Hogwarts fell behind, the mountains, the lake, the towers diminishing to a shape on the horizon and then to a presence felt rather than seen. The castle knew where he was. He could feel it, even now, the faint attention of very old magic tracking a person it had decided mattered, not because of what he'd been given or what he'd inherited, but because of how he'd chosen to spend his time in its halls. Learning. Really learning, not performing the act of it. Treating the walls and the texts and the people in them as things genuinely worth his full attention. He'd be back in September. He'd be back and there would be new books and new problems and the advanced seminar and Quidditch and whatever political developments August brought with it in Ragnarok's precise handwriting. There would be the ongoing question of Voldemort and what came next and the prophecy in its box and the road ahead that had a specific difficulty on it somewhere. He was ready for all of it. Not in the way of someone who had been prepared against their will, not the readiness of a shaped instrument meeting its designed purpose. In the way of someone who had spent a year choosing their own preparation, building their own understanding, assembling their own people, and arriving at the start of something genuinely large with the absolute unshakable certainty that whatever came at them next, they would face it as themselves. Athena shifted on her perch and regarded him with her serious amber eyes. I know, Harry said. She ruffled her feathers, satisfied. Ron looked up from the chessboard. Are you talking to your owl again? We have an understanding, Harry said. She told me to remind you, Ron said, with great seriousness, that you owe her 3 apologies for the turban incident. There was no turban incident involving Athena. She maintains otherwise. She's a liar. Athena looked away with the dignity of a creature entirely above this conversation. Hermione, without looking up, owls are not capable of sustained deception. Thank you, Hermione, Harry said. They are, however, capable of selective memory, which is functionally similar. Hermione, Harry said. I'm reading, she said, turning a page. Ask someone else. The train moved south through the summer, and Harry Potter, who had refused 22 lordships, had his 3 compulsions removed by a goblin elder, had walked into a chamber with Voldemort at the end of his first term, had testified before the Wisengamot, and had built something genuine from a starting point of nothing, looked out the window at England unrolling in the warm light and felt, completely and without qualification, like himself. Which was, it turned out, more than enough.